Inside the New York family court, my husband sat radiating absolute arrogance in a bespoke suit, while his mistress sat directly beside him, acting as his legal counsel. Chloe flashed a cruel smile as she slid a total asset forfeiture agreement toward the judge, demanding I leave our 7-year marriage with absolutely nothing. "She does not deserve a single dime of my money," Marcus stated loudly, ensuring his voice echoed off the polished mahogany walls. Chloe let out a sharp laugh, tapping her silver pen against the legal pad, celebrating her successful theft of my life savings right to my face. "I am Gianna, a 33-year-old senior director of corporate compliance, and I do not argue with parasites." I sat in complete silence, my posture impeccably straight, keeping my face an unreadable mask of absolute restraint. I did not shed a single tear as I slowly slid a heavily notarized manila envelope across the heavy wooden table. Judge Aris opened the seal, skimmed the single page of financial reality I had quietly orchestrated, and suddenly burst into a booming laugh. "Oh, this is good," the judge whispered. Marcus and Chloe's arrogant smiles instantly evaporated into a sickly, terrified panic. Before I tell you exactly how a corporate auditor dismantles a toxic husband, let me know where you are listening from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you know that true leverage always requires absolute silence. 72 hours before that gavel fell, my reality consisted of a freezing downpour and a blinking red light. I stood beneath the heavy stone awning of our Upper East Side building, my leather briefcase slipping slightly in my wet grip. I had just finished a grueling 90-hour corporate compliance audit for a tech merger. My muscles ached. Rainwater dripped from the hem of my wool trench coat, pooling on the imported slate tiles. I pressed my electronic access card against the brass security panel. A harsh error tone buzzed. A solid red indicator light illuminated the keypad. I wiped the rainwater from the magnetic strip with my cold thumb and tried a second time. The same flat rejection echoed in the empty vestibule. I looked up through the thick, reinforced glass of the lobby doors. The interior glowed with warm, ambient lighting, reflecting off the polished marble floors. Standing directly in the center of that warmth was Marcus. My husband wore a bespoke charcoal suit, his hands tucked casually into his pockets. He was not looking at me with the concern of a man whose wife was locked out in a storm. He was watching me with a calculated, predatory smirk. Standing right beside him was Chloe Vanguard. Her dark hair was flawlessly blown out. She wore a tailored crimson dress that contrasted sharply with the sterile corporate environment she usually inhabited. Marcus took a slow, deliberate step toward the glass. "Your access is permanently revoked," Marcus stated, his voice muffled but entirely legible through the heavy barrier. I did not bang my fists against the door. I placed my access card back into my trench coat pocket, my breathing remaining steady and measured. "You froze the joint accounts," I said quietly, watching the arrogant tilt of his head. Marcus adjusted his silk tie, his smirk widening into a full smile. "Every single penny is secured," Marcus answered without breaking eye contact. Chloe stepped forward, her expensive stiletto heels clicking on the other side of the glass. She held up a thick stack of legal documents. She pressed the front page flat against the transparent barrier, ensuring I could read the bold black text. "This is a drafted restraining order," Chloe sneered, tapping the glass with a manicured fingernail. I leaned in slightly. My eyes scanned the heavily drafted paragraphs. The document cited severe mental instability and erratic, dangerous behavior. They were actively building a fictitious narrative to discredit my sanity before I could even attempt to access my own financial records. "You need psychiatric help, Gianna, Chloe added, her tone dripping with weaponized sympathy. My jaw tightened until the muscles along my neck ached. I let my eyes trace the outline of Marcus's confident stance, memorizing the exact angle of his chin and the relaxed drop of his shoulders. I cataloged his smug expression, filing it away in the deepest, coldest corner of my mind. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice. I did not demand entry to my own home. I simply turned my back on the warm marble lobby and stepped directly into the freezing rain. The downpour soaked through the shoulders of my wool coat within seconds. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my heels striking the flooded pavement with rhythmic precision. The icy wind whipped through the urban canyon of the street, stinging my cheeks. I walked 3 blocks before stepping into the sheltered enclave of a brightly lit bank vestibule. I approached the automated teller machine. I inserted my primary debit card and entered my personal identification number. The screen loaded for 3 seconds before a glaring red banner flashed across the display. Account frozen. Please contact your branch manager. I withdrew the card, sliding it back into my wallet. I tried my secondary credit card. The machine spit it back out with the exact same error message. Marcus had not just locked the doors to the penthouse, he had executed a highly coordinated, systemic financial strike designed to strand me on the street with zero liquidity. He expected me to panic. He expected me to call him, weeping and begging for a hotel room or a taxi fare. Instead, I knelt on the wet tile floor. I unzipped the hidden bottom compartment of my leather briefcase. I bypassed the standard pockets and reached into the lining, pulling out a sealed waterproof envelope. Inside was $500 in crisp $20 bills. A forensic auditor never travels without untraceable contingency cash. I walked out of the vestibule and descended into the subway station. The screeching metal of the train wheels provided a harsh soundtrack as I rode the underground transit lines away from Manhattan. I needed a location far outside of Marcus's corporate sphere of influence. I needed a blind spot. 45 minutes later, I emerged into a gritty, neon-lit neighborhood in Queens. The rain had slowed to a persistent, freezing drizzle. I walked past rows of shuttered storefronts until I found a cheap internet cafe operating out of a cramped basement unit. The heavy glass door chimed as I pushed it open. The air inside smelled of stale, roasted coffee and overheated computer towers. A bored teenager sat behind a scarred laminate counter, barely looking up from his smartphone. "I need a private booth," I said, sliding 2 $20 bills across the counter. The clerk took the cash without a word and pointed toward a row of enclosed cubicles in the back. I walked to the farthest booth, pulling the thin privacy curtain shut behind me. The space was barely large enough to accommodate the plastic chair. I did not use their public desktop computers. I unclasped my leather briefcase and withdrew my own heavily encrypted corporate laptop. I set it on the sticky desk and pressed the power button. The screen flared to life, casting a harsh, pale blue light across my wet face. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I bypassed standard internet protocols, routing my connection through a series of offshore virtual private networks to mask my location. I activated my ghost server, a secure, invisible digital architecture I had built specifically for auditing hostile corporate takeovers. The interface loaded, a stark black screen with cascading lines of code. Marcus was a managing partner at a massive venture capital firm. He dealt in high-level financial maneuvering, projecting an image of unlimited liquidity. He relied on aggressive tactics, intimidation, and raw social power. I relied on unadulterated data. I breached the back end of our joint financial portfolio using my senior director compliance credentials. The dashboard materialized, displaying a sea of zero balances. Checking accounts, savings trusts, and emergency liquid funds were entirely wiped clean. I did not waste time staring at the empty accounts. I shifted my focus directly to the transaction ledgers. The routing numbers told a vivid, terrifying story. Over the past 12 hours, while I was trapped in a windowless boardroom executing my audit, Marcus had systematically drained $15 million in liquid marital assets. He had not moved the money into a standard domestic holding account. He had routed the funds through a convoluted maze of out-of-state holding companies. I typed a sequence of tracking commands, running a metadata analysis on the receiving accounts. The screen blinked rapidly, processing the complex algorithms. My eyes scanned the cascading lines of green code, searching for the terminal destination of my stolen life savings. The trace finally settled on a single corporate entity, registered in Delaware. I pulled up the public tax records for that specific shell company, cross-referencing the employer identification numbers. The managing director listed on the corporate charter was not Marcus. The name staring back at me was Sylvia Thorne, my mother-in-law. I leaned back in the cheap plastic chair, the stiff material creaking under my weight. The The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening clarity. Sylvia sat on the board of directors for Thorn Philanthropies, the family's massive charity foundation. Marcus was not just hiding the money in a divorce maneuver, he was using his own mother's tax-exempt charity foundation to wash the stolen $15 million. But the central question remained unanswered. Why did he need $15 million in untraceable cash overnight? A man in his position did not commit federal wire fraud and trigger a hostile lockout unless he was facing an immediate, catastrophic threat to his own survival. I opened a new terminal window. I initiated a deep dive audit into Thorn Capital's primary investment portfolio. I bypassed their public relations filings and dug straight into their active commercial real estate holdings. I needed to see exactly what Marcus was bleeding cash to protect. The progress bar in the center of my screen crawled forward, decrypting the venture capital firm's internal debt structure. I watched the bar hit 100%. A massive spreadsheet materialized, flooded with stark red warning indicators. My breath hitched, a sharp intake of cold air. Thorn Capital was not thriving. They were actively suffocating under the weight of a failing commercial real estate project in Brooklyn. Marcus had secretly leveraged his entire firm to fund the development, and the construction was hemorrhaging capital. He was desperate. He needed my $15 million to artificially inflate his balance sheet and stave off a catastrophic margin call. He locked me out in the freezing rain to prevent me from seeing the impending collapse of his empire. I stared at the glowing screen, my wet clothes clinging to my shivering frame. He thought isolating me would ensure his victory. He failed to realize that by severing my physical access to my own home, he had just removed the only moral restraint keeping me from auditing his entire life. A sharp notification pinged on my screen. It was an automated calendar alert synced from my hijacked personal email account. The alert detailed a high-profile charity gala hosted by Thorn Philanthropies, scheduled for tomorrow evening. Sylvia Thorn would be the keynote speaker. Marcus and Chloe would be in attendance, parading their fabricated success in front of the city's elite. They believed they had successfully eliminated me from the board. They had no idea I was already plotting my counterattack. I reached into my briefcase, pulled out a digital vendor pass I had retained from a previous corporate audit, and began reprogramming the magnetic barcode. I was going to that gala. The reprogrammed magnetic barcode clicked, flashing a steady green light on the security scanner. I pushed through the heavy brass service doors and stepped directly into the grand ballroom. The air was thick with the scent of roasted duck and crushed orchids. Waiters in pristine white jackets circulated seamlessly through a dense crowd of 500 elite donors. Crystal chandeliers cast a harsh, glittering light across a sea of custom tuxedos and designer silk gowns. I did not check my luggage. I stood near the catering staging area, my damp wool trench coat and wet leather briefcase providing a stark, aggressive contrast to the surrounding opulence. I scanned the room with the clinical detachment of a drone surveying a target. Marcus stood near the center stage. He held a half-empty champagne flute, projecting the aura of a conquering king. Chloe stood pressed against his side, wearing a sheer silver dress that caught the chandelier light. She dragged her manicured nails down the lapel of his expensive charcoal suit. Directly to their right stood Sylvia Thorn. My mother-in-law wore a dark velvet gown adorned with a heavy string of South Sea pearls. She carried a leather-bound gala program, dictating sharp instructions to a nervous event coordinator. Sylvia turned her head, her gaze sweeping the perimeter of the room. Her eyes snagged on my wet trench coat. She did not gasp. Her spine snapped perfectly straight. Sylvia tightened her grip on the leather program until her knuckles turned a sharp, pale white. She tapped Marcus on the shoulder and pointed a single manicured finger in my direction. Marcus looked up, his smug expression twisting into a look of absolute, arrogant amusement. He leaned down and whispered into Chloe's ear. Chloe threw her head back and let out a sharp, mocking laugh that cut completely through the ambient noise. Sylvia did not call security. She saw a rare opportunity for a public execution. She handed her empty glass to a passing waiter and marched directly up the carpeted steps of the main stage. She approached the podium, grabbing the silver microphone stand with both hands. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sylvia announced, her voice booming through the towering surround sound speakers. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. 500 wealthy guests halted their conversations, turning their attention toward the matriarch of the Thorn Empire. "We are gathered tonight to celebrate the massive financial success of Thorn Capital," Sylvia continued, projecting a tone of weaponized elegance. I remained perfectly still. I kept my breathing slow and measured, analyzing the precise angle of her jaw and the vindictive gleam in her eyes. "However, true wealth requires strict curation," Sylvia said, sweeping her gaze across the silent ballroom. "You must eventually purge the elements that drag your legacy down into the mud." The crowd murmured in confused agreement, unsure of where the speech was heading. Sylvia raised her left arm, pointing her finger directly at my shadowed corner. 500 pairs of eyes shifted simultaneously, locking onto my damp clothes and dripping hair. "For 7 years, my son attempted to polish a worthless stone," Sylvia stated, her voice dripping with pure aristocratic venom. "He brought a working-class compliance auditor into our home, hoping her proximity to our excellence might cure her pathetic, middle-class mediocrity." A low ripple of cruel laughter rolled through the front tables. Chloe smiled, resting her chin on Marcus's shoulder. "As you can see, the experiment was a complete failure," Sylvia sneered, tapping the microphone for emphasis. Marcus raised his champagne flute toward me in a highly theatrical, mocking toast. "We are officially correcting that error tonight," Sylvia declared, her voice rising to a triumphant crescendo. "Marcus is finally taking a superior partner, a woman of true pedigree and flawless legal intellect." Sylvia gestured dramatically toward the floor. "Please raise your glasses to the future Mrs. Chloe Thorn," Sylvia demanded, initiating a round of aggressive applause. The ballroom erupted in a standing ovation. Wealthy donors clinked their crystal glasses, cheering for the woman who had helped steal $15 million of my marital assets. Chloe stepped forward, waving to the crowd with practiced royalty. Marcus pulled her in for a lingering, possessive kiss. They waited for me to break. They waited for the discarded, humiliated wife to burst into tears, drop her briefcase, and run weeping through the service exit. They desperately wanted a chaotic, emotional breakdown to validate their superiority. I did not give them a single drop of satisfaction. I did not shift my weight. I did not blink. My face remained an impenetrable mask of cold, calculated restraint. I let the applause wash over me, absorbing the sheer magnitude of their arrogance. I translated every mocking laugh and every clinking glass into raw, usable data. I stepped out of the shadows and walked slowly toward the edge of the nearest VIP dining table. The guests seated there recoiled slightly, pulling their expensive silk chairs away from my damp coat. I ignored them entirely. Resting in the center of their pristine linen tablecloth was a stack of glossy, gold-embossed gala programs. I reached out and picked one up. The thick cardstock felt heavy in my hand. "Are you completely lost?" Marcus shouted over the fading applause, his voice laced with cruel amusement. I did not answer him. I opened the program. My eyes bypassed the photographs of smiling executives and the flowery paragraphs detailing their supposed philanthropic mission. I flipped directly to the back pages, zeroing in on the itemized sponsor directory and the event operating budget. A forensic auditor does not care about the speeches. We only care about the ledgers. My eyes scanned the cascading rows of financial data, running rapid mental calculations. Thorn Philanthropies listed a catering and venue budget of over $2 million for this single evening. I looked at the floral arrangements. I looked at the quality of the caviar circulating on the silver trays. The visual math was catastrophic. The physical reality of the ballroom represented a maximum expenditure of $300,000. There was a massive gaping hole of $1,700,000 missing from the operating budget. I traced my finger down the printed column of primary vendors. The catering contract was not awarded to a local New York hospitality group. It was awarded to a corporate entity named Apex Culinary Logistics. I recognized the formatting of the corporate identification number listed next to the name. It was not a hospitality firm. It was a holding company registered in Delaware. It was the exact same Delaware shell network I had identified on my Ghost server 48 hours ago. My jaw tightened. A cold, electric thrill shot down my spine. The pieces of Marcus's financial puzzle slammed together with violent clarity. Sylvia was not just hosting a charity gala to boost her social standing. The entire foundation was a highly sophisticated laundering machine. Marcus had drained $15 million from our joint marital accounts. He funneled that stolen liquidity straight into his mother's tax-exempt charity under the guise of anonymous elite donations. Sylvia was now filtering that dirty money out of the foundation by overpaying fake Delaware vendors like Apex Culinary Logistics. The shell companies were washing the cash, scrubbing my name off the origin wire transfers, and routing clean, untraceable capital directly into Marcus's failing commercial real estate project in Brooklyn. They were standing on a stage, mocking my intelligence, while actively handing me a printed map of their federal crimes. "Put the program down, Gianna," Chloe sneered, stepping away from Marcus and walking toward the edge of the dance floor. I looked up from the glossy pages. Chloe stood 10 feet away, glaring at me with absolute contempt. "You do not understand anything printed in that booklet," Chloe added, crossing her arms tightly. I stared directly into her eyes, maintaining a terrifying, unbroken silence. I slowly closed the gala program. I gripped the spine of the booklet, folded it perfectly in half, and slid it into the side pocket of my leather briefcase. "Security is on the way," Sylvia announced from the podium, her tone dropping into a harsh, impatient bark. "Remove yourself from these premises immediately before you are dragged out." I did not argue. I did not utter a single word of defense. I simply turned my back on the stage. I walked down the center aisle of the ballroom, forcing the wealthy elite to step aside and clear a path for me. My damp trench coat brushed against their pristine tables, leaving a trail of cold reality in my wake. I pushed through the heavy brass doors of the main exit and stepped out into the opulent hotel lobby. The oppressive heat of the ballroom faded, replaced by the cool, sterile air of the corridor. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket, my mind racing through the corporate architecture I had just uncovered. I had the routing destination. I knew exactly how the money was moving, but knowing the mechanism was not enough. To legally seize a Delaware shell network and trace the funds back to Marcus's Brooklyn debt, I needed to breach a severely restricted tier of corporate banking. I needed institutional-level access. My standard compliance credentials were no longer sufficient. I needed a proxy. I needed someone who commanded enough institutional capital to force the Delaware banks to open their encrypted ledgers. I walked out of the hotel lobby and stepped back into the freezing New York rain. I stood under the heavy stone awning, pulling my coat tight against the wind. I scrolled through my encrypted contact list, bypassing the names of colleagues and standard financial regulators. I stopped on a single, highly restricted number. It was a direct line to a man who operated far above the petty social climbing of the Thorne family. He was a billionaire private equity titan whose corporate empire I had saved from a catastrophic hostile takeover 5 years ago. He owed me a massive, unspoken debt. I pressed the call button, listening to the dial tone ring out into the cold night. Marcus thought he had successfully isolated me. He had no idea I was about to call in the heaviest artillery on Wall Street. The line connected on the second ring. A deep, commanding voice answered immediately, anticipating a high-level corporate emergency. I did not explain my damp clothes, the humiliating gala, or the physical toll the freezing New York downpour was taking on my body. I simply told Nathaniel Croft I needed a secure digital relay established in exactly 30 minutes. He agreed without asking a single question. I lowered my phone, slipping it back into the pocket of my ruined wool trench coat, and stepped out from under the stone awning. I needed a secure, dry location with a stable internet connection to establish the proxy link. 2 blocks away from the Thorne Philanthropies Gala, a towering luxury hotel cast a brilliant, warm glow onto the flooded pavement. I walked through the revolving glass doors, completely ignoring the judgmental stares of the pristine concierge staff eyeing my soaked hair and dripping coat. I approached the polished mahogany front desk. I bypassed my personal debit cards and pulled out my heavy titanium corporate credit card. It was issued directly to me by my compliance firm, an account completely isolated from the marital assets Marcus had systematically drained. "A single room for the night," I said quietly, sliding the cold metal card across the marble counter. The clerk swiped the magnetic strip through his terminal. The machine emitted a sharp, buzzing rejection tone. He frowned, wiping the titanium surface on his vest, and inserted the biometric chip directly into the reader. A glaring red error message instantly illuminated his monitor. "I am sorry," he said, his customer service tone cooling into suspicion. "Your issuing bank placed a hard fraud lock on this account." My jaw tightened until a dull ache radiated up to my temples. I did not argue with the clerk or cause a scene. I pulled my phone from my pocket and bypassed my standard banking application, logging directly into my corporate security dashboard. The interface loaded, displaying a cascading wall of severe red security alerts. Chloe Vanguard had not just drafted a fictitious restraining order to mock me. She had weaponized her position as senior corporate counsel at Thorn Capital. Using her firm's official legal letterhead, she had filed malicious, fabricated fraud reports against my federal Social Security number. She explicitly claimed my financial identity had been severely compromised by a hostile actor, intentionally triggering a catastrophic, automated lockdown on every single personal and professional credit line attached to my name. This was a highly coordinated siege. They were actively trying to strand me on the street with absolutely zero liquidity. They assumed the freezing rain, the public humiliation, and the sheer physical exhaustion would force me into total submission. They wanted me to crawl back to the Upper East Side penthouse, weeping and begging for access to my own money. I slid the dead titanium card back into my leather wallet. I did not waste time showing the desk clerk my corporate identification or pleading for a manual override. I turned my back on the warm, opulent lobby and walked directly out into the violent storm. I walked for 20 minutes, forcing my heels to strike the flooded pavement with rhythmic, unyielding precision. I let the freezing rain numb my skin until the towering luxury high-rises gave way to the gritty, neon-lit perimeter of the industrial transit district. I scanned the bleak street and found a decaying, single-story motel tucked directly beneath an elevated train track. The flickering blue vacancy sign hummed with failing electricity. I pushed open the glass door of the cramped lobby. A bored night manager sat slumped behind a thick sheet of scratched bulletproof plexiglass, completely engrossed in a portable television. I unzipped the hidden bottom compartment of my leather briefcase. I pulled out a stack of crisp $20 bills from my untraceable emergency cash reserves. I slid $200 through the metal transaction slot. "I need a room with a working Ethernet port," I stated flatly. The manager took the cash without even bothering to look at my face. He slid a heavy brass key through the slot, tossing a faded plastic room tag onto the metal counter. Room 12 smelled aggressively of stale cigarette smoke and industrial bleach. The floral bedspread was thin and faded, and the fluorescent light above the scratched vanity flickered violently. It was a staggering, absolute downgrade from the multi-million-dollar penthouse I legally owned. But the depressing aesthetic was entirely irrelevant. The room possessed a solid door, a heavy iron deadbolt, and a wired internet connection. It was the perfect operational blind spot. I peeled off my soaked trench coat, draping the heavy wool over the rusted radiator. I set my encrypted corporate laptop squarely on the scratched laminate desk and plugged the Ethernet cable directly into the motherboard. I rapidly bypassed the motel's unsecured network, routing my signal through a complex labyrinth of offshore virtual private networks to entirely mask my location. I opened a secure, heavily encrypted communication channel. The timer on my screen hit exactly 30 minutes. Nathaniel Croft appeared on my monitor. The 60-year-old billionaire titan of private equity sat in his austere, dimly lit corporate war room. 2 years ago, I had uncovered a massive, deeply buried liability during a tech merger, successfully saving Croft Global Holdings from a catastrophic billion-dollar acquisition failure. He owed me an unpayable debt. Men like Croft valued absolute, uncompromising loyalty far above raw capital. "Gianna," Nathaniel said. his sharp eyes instantly scanning my damp hair and the cheap motel walls visible in my background. "Who am I destroying tonight?" "I do not need a loan, Nathaniel," I answered, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I need your proxy." Nathaniel leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on his obsidian desk. He understood the absolute gravity of the request. I was not asking for a favor. I was asking for the digital keys to his institutional trading platform. I needed the clearance level of a Wall Street billionaire to force the Delaware banking networks to immediately open their shielded ledgers. "The authorization codes are transmitting now," Nathaniel replied without a single second of hesitation. "Burn them to the ground." The video feed terminated instantly. A bright green decryption key materialized directly on my desktop. I cracked my knuckles, the joints popping sharply in the quiet, damp room. I executed the Croft Global proxy protocols, actively masking my single laptop with the digital weight of a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm. I breached the Delaware corporate registry, the sophisticated digital firewalls, which normally blocked standard compliance auditors and required weeks of legal subpoenas to bypass, instantly collapsed under the simulated pressure of institutional capital. I entered the specific corporate identification number for Apex Culinary Logistics. That was the fake catering vendor Sylvia Thorne had weaponized to wash my stolen money during the charity gala. The shell company's internal ledgers cascaded down my monitor in a rapid waterfall of green data. I traced the $15 million wire transfer Marcus had initiated from our joint marital accounts. The corporate architecture was designed to operate as a labyrinth. Apex Culinary Logistics immediately scrubbed my name from the origin data, converting the liquid cash into untraceable corporate bonds. I tracked those specific bonds as they bounced through 3 additional Delaware holding entities. A dizzying financial maze engineered specifically to confuse federal regulators and hide the terminal destination. But every financial maze possesses an exit, and I now possessed the master key. I locked onto the final routing number. The $15 million funneled directly into a massive escrow account, managed entirely by Thorne Capital. I cross-referenced the account routing numbers with the venture capital firm's active commercial development portfolio. A massive, detailed spreadsheet materialized on my monitor, flashing with severe red warning indicators. The money was anchoring a $120 million commercial tech hub project located in Brooklyn, New York. I bypassed their public relations filings and pulled the internal architectural assessments, the structural engineering reports, and the municipal permit filings. The project was not just failing, it was a catastrophic, inescapable financial sinkhole. The foundation required massive, unforeseen subterranean reinforcements to prevent the entire structure from collapsing into the unstable soil. The resulting construction delays were hemorrhaging capital at a lethal, unprecedented rate. Marcus had secretly leveraged Thorne Capital's entire liquidity pool to fund the development. The primary construction loan was rapidly approaching a massive balloon payment. If Marcus failed to inject $15 million of liquid capital to stabilize the debt ratio, the primary lenders would foreclose on the property immediately. The resulting cross-collateralization clauses would trigger a devastating domino effect, completely obliterating Thorne Capital and bankrupting his entire family. He had stolen my life savings simply to plug a fatal hole in a sinking ship. I stared at the glowing red numbers, a cold, predatory satisfaction settling deep into my chest. He thought isolating me in the freezing rain would secure his failing empire. He failed to realize he had just handed a senior director of corporate due diligence the exact blueprints to his absolute destruction. I did not just know where my stolen money was hiding, I knew exactly how to weaponize his $120 million toxic debt directly against him. A sharp, aggressive knock suddenly hammered against the thin wooden door of my motel room. The violent sound shattered the heavy silence of the space. I froze, my eyes darting toward the rusted iron deadbolt. No one knew I was here. I had paid the night manager in untraceable cash and actively bypassed all standard cellular networks to ensure absolute operational security. The knocking rapidly escalated into a violent, rhythmic pounding that rattled the cheap door in its frame. "We know you are in there, Gianna." A muffled, arrogant voice demanded through the cheap wood. It was Chloe. My eyes dropped instantly to the glowing screen of my laptop. While I had been tearing through the Delaware shell networks, my operating system had quietly logged an aggressive, localized ping against my mobile phone's global positioning receiver. She had not just frozen my credit cards to strand me on the street. She had illegally utilized Thorn Capital's private security contractors to actively track my cellular location. My pulse remained incredibly steady. I reached out and closed my laptop, securing the $120 million digital explosive safely inside the encrypted hard drive. I stood up, walked deliberately toward the rattling door, and prepared to face the next layer of their extortion. I disengaged the rusted iron deadbolt. The cheap wooden door swung open, scraping loudly against the warped linoleum floor of the motel room. Chloe Vanguard stood in the narrow exterior corridor. The freezing rain whipped through the open concrete breezeway, but she stood completely untouched beneath the rusted metal overhang. She was flanked by two massive men wearing tailored black suits and coiled tactical earpieces. They were private security contractors, hired muscle paid to physically intimidate a woman they believed was already broken and destitute. Chloe wore a pristine white wool trench coat that provided a sharp, aggressive contrast to the decaying urban environment surrounding us. She held a thick, heavy-stock manila envelope in her right hand. "You are incredibly difficult to track down," Chloe said, her voice laced with heavy condescension. I did not step back to let her inside the room. I planted my bare feet firmly on the faded carpet of the threshold, blocking the entryway entirely. I kept my breathing slow and measured, analyzing the precise distance between the two security contractors. "Hand me the documents," I stated quietly, refusing to break eye contact. Chloe let out a sharp, mocking laugh. She stepped forward, closing the distance until the toes of her expensive leather boots nearly touched my feet. She shoved the heavy envelope directly against my chest. "This is a finalized post-nuptial asset forfeiture," Chloe sneered, her manicured fingers tapping the thick paper. I took the envelope, feeling the dense, physical weight of the legal trap. I did not open it immediately. I let my eyes drop to her left hand. Resting prominently on her ring finger was a massive, flawless, radiant-cut diamond. It was a new acquisition, glittering violently under the flickering fluorescent lights of the motel walkway. It was the exact diamond I had traced back to the commingled client escrow funds just a few hours prior. "Marcus is offering a $10,000 relocation fee," Chloe continued, her chin tilting upward in absolute arrogance. I ran my thumb along the sealed edge of the envelope. $10,000 was a pathetic, insulting fraction of the $15 million Marcus had stolen from my marital accounts. It was a highly calculated number, designed to sound like a temporary lifeline to a desperate, stranded woman while legally stripping her of millions in equitable distribution. "Take the money and disappear," Chloe demanded, pointing a single finger at the document. "I do not sign agreements under duress," I answered flatly. The smug expression on Chloe's face instantly hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. She stepped even closer, lowering her voice to a harsh, venomous whisper intended only for my ears. "You will sign it today," Chloe threatened, her eyes narrowing into dark slits, "or I will completely obliterate your entire professional existence." I did not flinch. I let the silence hang in the freezing air, forcing her to fully articulate the exact parameters of her extortion. "I have already drafted a comprehensive federal complaint," Chloe stated, a cruel smile returning to her lips. My jaw tightened, the muscles along my neck straining against the biting cold. "I fabricated a beautiful trail of digital evidence," Chloe whispered, leaning in closer, "proving you committed corporate espionage against Thorn Capital. If you fight this," Chloe added, gesturing to the security guards behind her, "I will submit the file directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission." She was actively weaponizing her position as senior corporate counsel to destroy my senior director compliance credentials. A federal investigation into corporate espionage, even a completely fabricated one, would trigger an immediate, catastrophic suspension of my professional licenses. I would lose every single client on my roster. I would be permanently blacklisted from the mergers and acquisitions industry. "You will be permanently unemployable," Chloe sneered, her breath forming a white cloud in the freezing air. "Sign the paper, Gianna." She snapped her fingers. The security contractor to her right immediately stepped forward. He reached into his tailored jacket and produced a heavy silver pen and a small yellow delivery receipt. He held them out to me, his massive frame positioned to deliberately block my view of the street. They expected me to panic. They expected the crushing weight of federal ruin to break my spirit right there on the frozen concrete. They wanted me to snatch the silver pen, rip open the envelope, and sign away my $15 million marital estate out of sheer, blinding terror. I looked at the silver pen, then I looked directly into Chloe's eyes. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice to argue about the blatant illegality of her blackmail. I reached out and took the small yellow delivery receipt. I ignored the silver pen entirely. I pulled my own cheap black ink pen from the pocket of my trousers. I pressed the yellow slip of paper against the doorframe and signed my name with steady, flawless precision, legally acknowledging only the physical receipt of the package. I peeled the yellow carbon copy off the pad and handed it back to the massive security contractor. I kept the thick, manila envelope tucked firmly under my arm. "I have received the delivery," I said, my voice eerily calm. Chloe frowned, staring at the unsigned post-nuptial agreement still sealed inside the envelope. "You need to sign the actual contract," Chloe demanded, her voice rising in sudden irritation. "You forgot to read the fine print," I replied quietly, staring at her diamond ring. Before she could utter another word, I stepped backward into the motel room and slammed the heavy wooden door directly in her face. I engaged the iron deadbolt with a sharp, echoing crack. I threw the metal security chain into its track. Chloe immediately began pounding her fists against the exterior of the door. The wood rattled violently in its frame. She shouted muffled threats through the thin barrier, commanding me to open the door and sign the forfeiture. I ignored the noise completely. I turned my back to the door and walked straight to the scratched laminate desk. I dropped the thick manila envelope onto the desk beside my encrypted laptop. I did not tear it open with frantic, shaking hands. I pulled my specialized crafting scalpel from my leather briefcase. I carefully sliced the top seam of the envelope, preserving the structural integrity of the packaging. I slid the heavy stack of legal documents out onto the desk. The postnuptial agreement was 30 pages long. It was incredibly dense, filled with aggressive legal maneuvering designed to permanently sever my access to Thorn Capital and all marital liquid assets. But a forensic auditor does not care about the threatening paragraphs. We only care about the underlying formatting. I bypassed the signature lines and the extortion clauses. I flipped the stack of papers over, analyzing the bottom margin of the very last page. Printed in microscopic black ink, just below the final liability waiver, was a unique alphanumeric barcode. It was a digital tracking sequence automatically generated by professional legal drafting software. Chloe believed she was orchestrating a flawless, untraceable extortion scheme. She failed to realize that every single piece of corporate legal software embeds a permanent digital fingerprint into its exported files. I opened my briefcase and pulled out a high-resolution portable document scanner. I connected the device to my encrypted laptop via a secure universal serial bus cable. I fed the final page of the postnuptial agreement into the scanner. The machine whirred quietly, pulling the thick paper through the optical lens. The scanned image materialized on my monitor. I zoomed in on the microscopic barcode at the bottom of the page. I launched a proprietary metadata extraction program, a specialized tool I utilize strictly for analyzing corporate compliance violations during hostile mergers. I highlighted the alphanumeric sequence and initiated the decryption protocol. The heavy pounding on the motel door finally stopped. I heard the muffled sound of Chloe shouting a final, venomous warning before the heavy footsteps of her security contractors echoed down the exterior walkway, fading into the freezing rain. She was leaving, assuming I was sitting in the quiet room weeping over my ruined career. On my screen, the decryption progress bar hit 100%. The raw metadata cascaded down the monitor in bright green text. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the localized origin data. The document was not drafted on a personal computer. The metadata explicitly detailed the exact server architecture used to generate the portable document format. The Internet Protocol address tied to the drafting software belonged to a highly restricted, secure network. It was the primary legal server of Thorn Capital. A cold, predatory thrill radiated through my chest. My pulse slowed to a steady, rhythmic beat. Chloe Vanguard was the senior corporate counsel for the venture capital firm. She was bound by incredibly strict federal attorney-client firewall regulations. By using Thorn Capital's proprietary legal servers to draft a personal divorce document designed to extort the managing partner's wife, she had just committed a catastrophic compliance violation. But the metadata revealed something infinitely worse. The timestamps embedded in the document creation log showed that Chloe had drafted the extortion clauses and the fabricated corporate espionage threats at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a Tuesday. She had weaponized the firm's legal infrastructure to commit federal extortion while actively on the clock, operating entirely within the corporate walls of Thorn Capital. She had just tied her personal crimes directly to the holding company's primary liability insurance. I did not panic over her threat to the Securities and Exchange Commission. I opened a new encrypted file on my Ghost server. I saved the extracted metadata, the barcode scans, and the timestamp logs into a secure digital vault. I had just acquired the exact physical evidence required to prove severe attorney misconduct and federal extortion. Marcus believed he had stranded me with zero leverage. He had no idea his mistress had just handed me the very weapon I needed to initiate her permanent disbarment. I stared at the glowing green data on my screen, my mind already calculating the precise moment I would detonate this evidence in a sworn courtroom. But Chloe's fabricated corporate espionage threat presented a new, immediate problem. If she was reckless enough to commit extortion on company servers, she was reckless enough to actually file the false federal reports. I could not wait for the divorce hearing to neutralize her. I needed to isolate Marcus from his elite network before he could utilize his corporate influence to legitimize her lies. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out my secondary encrypted cellular phone. The screen illuminated, displaying a completely clean, untraceable interface. Marcus had spent the morning trying to destroy my sanity. It was time to return the favor by quietly dismantling his professional reality. I opened a secure spreadsheet and began compiling a comprehensive list of Thorn Capital's most lucrative due diligence clients. My fingers moved across the keyboard in a steady, unbroken rhythm. I bypassed standard directories, pulling the primary contact information for every venture capital firm, institutional investor, and private equity group currently anchored to Marcus. I needed to isolate the specific clients who were keeping his fraudulent empire afloat. Before I could finish indexing the third column, my secondary encrypted cellular phone vibrated aggressively against the scratched laminate desk. The caller identification displayed the name of a chief executive officer from a prominent international logistics firm. He was one of my most reliable compliance clients. His company provided a massive monthly retainer for my quarterly corporate audits, representing a significant pillar of my independent income. I picked up the device, the cold metal casing pressing against my palm. "This is Gianna," I answered smoothly. A heavy, incredibly uncomfortable silence lingered on the other end of the line. I heard the faint rustle of thick paper and the quiet hum of a distant boardroom air conditioning unit. "Gianna, we are suspending your firm's retainer," the executive said, his tone thick with forced professional distance. My posture snapped perfectly straight. I did not interrupt him. I let the silence hang in the cheap motel room, forcing him to fill the awkward void he had just created. "Marcus Thorn contacted our board of directors an hour ago," the executive continued, clearing his throat nervously. I stared at the peeling yellow wallpaper. Marcus was moving with frantic, desperate speed. "He informed us you are experiencing a severe psychiatric breakdown," the executive stated, his voice dropping into a harsh, hushed whisper. My jaw tightened until a sharp ache radiated behind my ears. I gripped the edge of the laminate desk. "Marcus also disclosed a pending federal investigation," the executive added, rushing through the final devastating syllables. "We cannot risk the liability." "I understand your position," I replied, keeping my voice entirely devoid of panic. The executive disconnected the call instantly. The The line went dead. He did not ask for my defense. He did not ask for medical records or legal proof. In the ruthless, high-stakes world of corporate mergers and acquisitions, the mere whisper of mental instability combined with a Securities and Exchange Commission probe was an absolute professional death sentence. Marcus was actively weaponizing his massive social capital to legitimize Chloe's fabricated extortion plot. A sharp metallic chime echoed from my laptop speakers. An automated email notification materialized on my monitor. I clicked the icon. It was a formal contract termination notice from another major client, a massive biotech acquisition group based in Manhattan. The subject line cited unforeseen administrative restructuring, but the underlying message was perfectly clear. Marcus was systematically calling my entire professional network. He was aggressively starving me out, deliberately severing my income streams to ensure I could not afford high-level legal representation for the upcoming divorce hearing. He believed the crushing weight of sudden professional ruin would force me into total submission. He expected me to call his private phone, weeping and begging for a truce. I did not shed a single tear. I did not throw my phone against the motel room wall. I placed the cellular device face down on the desk. My breathing slowed, pulling the stale, bleach-scented air deep into my lungs. My pulse settled into a slow, rhythmic, terrifying beat. A cold, predatory clarity washed over my mind. Marcus thought he was a mastermind strategically removing my pieces from the board. He completely failed to realize that by personally contacting my most lucrative clients, he had just handed me a direct, verified communication channel to his primary funding sources. I cracked my knuckles, the joints popping sharply in the quiet, damp room. I closed the spreadsheet containing his client roster and opened a new encrypted document. I did not draft a desperate, emotional defense of my sanity. I did not write a pathetic plea for my clients to trust me over my highly influential husband. A forensic auditor does not argue with malicious rumors. We deal exclusively in unadulterated financial data. I initiated a comprehensive financial health report on Thorn Capital. I bypassed standard compliance templates and built a highly specialized, ruthlessly detailed risk assessment document. I pulled the extracted metadata from the Delaware shell companies I had breached during the night. I integrated the alarming structural engineering reports, specifically detailing the subterranean foundation failures and municipal permit violations, driving the massive construction delays at the failing $120 million tech hub project in Brooklyn. My fingers flew across the keyboard, translating the complex offshore wire transfers into stark, undeniable visual charts. I mapped out the catastrophic debt ratio Marcus was desperately attempting to hide from his investors. I highlighted the exact margin calls that Thorn Capital was currently failing to meet, exposing a 40% liquidity deficit. I documented the illegal commingling of client escrow funds, carefully removing Chloe's name to protect my future legal leverage, but leaving the devastating raw numbers entirely intact. The resulting document was a 12-page masterpiece of corporate destruction. It painted a vivid, terrifying picture of a venture capital firm standing exactly 1 inch away from total catastrophic bankruptcy. It proved, using Marcus's own internal ledgers, that he was not a visionary managing partner. He was a desperate, over-leveraged liability, bleeding cash at a lethal, unprecedented rate. I exported the final risk assessment into a heavily encrypted portable document format. I did not attach my name to the file. I did not use my official corporate email address. I routed my connection through a labyrinth of offshore virtual private networks, masking my location entirely. I generated a phantom email address routed through a secure server in Switzerland that could never be traced back to this cheap motel room in Queens. I opened a new secure transmission window. I attached the encrypted risk assessment. I copied the direct email addresses of the exact clients Marcus had just called. He had reached out to them to poison my reputation and cut my lifelines. I was going to use those exact same communication lines to poison his entire financial future. The subject line remained stark and unadorned. I typed 3 words: Thorn Capital Liquidity. I moved the cursor over the send button. I stared at the screen, visualizing Marcus sitting in his penthouse, laughing with Chloe, believing he had just successfully annihilated my career. I clicked the mouse. The progress bar flashed across my screen in bright neon green. The data packets moved silently through the encrypted network, completely invisible to the outside world. I watched the bar hit 100%. The transmission cleared with a soft chime, delivering the toxic financial reality directly into the secure executive inboxes of the most powerful institutional investors in the city. I leaned back in the stiff wooden chair, the cheap plastic creaking under my weight. A slow, chilling satisfaction settled deep into my chest. Tomorrow morning, those top-tier executives would open that anonymous file. Their internal risk management teams would verify the construction delays and trace the offshore routing numbers. The sheer mathematical accuracy of the data would trigger immediate, catastrophic internal panics across their boards. Marcus was frantically trying to secure emergency capital to cover his massive, impending balloon payment for the Brooklyn project. He relied heavily on those exact clients to invest in his failing vision. He thought his phone calls this morning had successfully isolated me from the market. He had no idea I had just isolated him. By warning those institutional investors of his impending collapse, I had permanently closed their checkbooks. I had just severed his only remaining lifelines. The moment they read that report, Thorn Capital would become completely radioactive. No legitimate financial institution would lend him a single dime. My laptop screen flickered slightly as a new batch of decrypted escrow ledgers loaded into my ghost server. The $120 million commercial loan was ticking down like a synchronized explosive. Marcus was completely out of time. And thanks to my anonymous report, he was now completely out of potential investors. He would have to rely entirely on my stolen $15 million to survive the week. I stared at the glowing red numbers on my monitor, my eyes scanning the cascading lines of debt. I was calculating the exact moment his fabricated house of cards would collapse under the weight of his own staggering arrogance. He wanted to play a high-stakes game of corporate warfare, utilizing petty rumors and fabricated extortion. I was going to ensure he never stepped foot inside a boardroom again. Before I could analyze the next block of debt, my screen flashed with a high-priority calendar alert synchronized from the New York State Family Court database. The notification bathed my face in a harsh, white light. Marcus was not done maneuvering. The digital alert confirmed that he was escalating the legal timeline, pushing us rapidly toward a final, inescapable confrontation. He had clearly leveraged a corrupt contact within the New York State judicial system to abruptly bypass standard docket delays. I swiped the notification off my screen, the harsh red banner vanishing into the dark background of my desktop. I did not have weeks to build my case. I had hours. I closed the calendar application and shifted my entire focus back to the primary target. The $120 million commercial real estate project in Brooklyn was the heavy anchor dragging his entire empire into the abyss. I loaded the raw structural engineering reports I had decrypted from the Delaware Shell network. I compared the initial municipal building permits against the revised subterranean assessments. The math was catastrophic. The foundation of the tech hub was actively sinking into an unstable water table. The general contractors were demanding massive, daily financial overages just to keep the primary steel supports from buckling into the mud. I pulled Thorn Capital's internal operating budget into my ghost server, my eyes tracking the cascading rows of daily expenditures. The construction delays were hemorrhaging capital at a lethal rate of $500,000 a week. Marcus did not possess the liquid assets to sustain that level of catastrophic bleeding. Even with my stolen $15 million serving as a temporary tourniquet, his debt ratio was entirely unsustainable. The primary commercial lender would not wait for the concrete to dry. They would demand a massive margin call to offset the physical risk to the property. My secondary cellular phone vibrated sharply against the scratched laminate desk. The encrypted caller identification displayed Nathaniel Croft's secure routing number. I picked up the heavy device and pressed it against my ear. "The institutional investors received your anonymous package," Nathaniel stated smoothly, his deep voice carrying flawlessly over the secure line. "Did they sever their funding?" I asked quietly, keeping my gaze locked on the glowing monitor. "They panicked immediately," Nathaniel confirmed, the faint rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock echoing in his background. 4 major private equity groups withdrew their capital commitments within the last hour. Then, Thorn Capital is actively defaulting, I noted, my pulse remaining incredibly steady. That is the anomaly, Nathaniel replied, a sharp edge of predatory curiosity piercing his professional tone. His primary commercial lender issued a massive margin call this afternoon. Marcus paid it in full exactly 20 minutes ago. My jaw tightened until the muscles along my neck ached. I stared at the flashing red deficit markers scrolling across my screen. The math does not support that action, I answered flatly. He found a sudden injection of pristine liquid cash, Nathaniel countered without hesitation. I will find the source, I said, terminating the call with a swift press of my thumb. I set the phone face down on the desk. Marcus did not just miraculously generate millions of dollars in untraceable cash while actively losing his primary institutional investors. He was pulling emergency capital from a hidden, heavily restricted reservoir. I initiated a comprehensive trace on the margin call payment. I bypassed the standard commercial banking portals and accessed the Federal Wire Transfer Clearinghouse, utilizing my Senior Director compliance credentials. The digital firewalls that normally blocked standard auditors dissolved instantly under my security clearance. I isolated the exact timestamp of the massive payment Nathaniel had just mentioned. The digital paper trail materialized on my monitor in bright green text. The money had not originated from Thorn Capital's primary operating accounts. It had not come from the convoluted Delaware shell networks Sylvia Thorn was using to wash my stolen marital assets. The routing numbers trace back to a highly restricted, federally protected tier of corporate banking, client escrow. My breathing slowed, pulling the stale, bleach-scented air of the motel room deep into my lungs, a cold, absolute clarity settled heavily into my chest. Venture capital firms routinely held millions of dollars in client escrow accounts, but those funds were strictly quarantined by severe federal regulations. Using client money to cover personal margin calls or internal operating deficits was not just a fireable offense, it was catastrophic federal wire fraud. However, Marcus could not authorize an escrow breach entirely on his own. Corporate compliance firewalls required a dual signature protocol to move those specific protected funds. He needed a proxy with top-tier legal clearance to physically initiate the outbound wire transfer. He needed his senior corporate counsel. I pulled up the exact digital signature packet attached to the margin call payment. I extracted the metadata and decrypted the author identification tag. The confirmation verified my suspicion instantly. Chloe Vanguard had personally authorized the illicit transfer. I stared at her name glowing brightly on the pale screen. She had stood outside my motel door just hours ago, threatening to destroy my entire professional career with a fabricated federal complaint. Now, she was actively handing me the exact digital rope required to permanently hang her. I dug deeper into the escrow ledgers, my fingers moving across the keyboard in a relentless, unbroken rhythm. If Chloe was reckless enough to breach a federally protected account to save Marcus from bankruptcy, she was certainly reckless enough to skim from the top for her own benefit. I cross-referenced the outgoing corporate wire transfers against the internal client deposit logs. I ran a rapid comparative analysis, searching for any secondary monetary leaks. The numbers did not align perfectly. There was a secondary, smaller outflow of capital initiated exactly 3 days prior. The exact amount was $450,000. I tracked that specific wire transfer through the Federal Clearinghouse. It did not go to a commercial real estate lender. It did not go to a construction contractor in Brooklyn. It landed directly in the corporate holding account of an exclusive, high-end diamond importer based entirely in Manhattan. My mind flashed back to the freezing concrete walkway outside my motel room. I visualized Chloe standing perfectly dry beneath the rusted metal overhang, shoving the extortion document aggressively against my chest. I remembered the massive, flawless, radiant-cut diamond glittering violently on her left hand under the flickering fluorescent lights. She did not just commit federal wire fraud to save Thorn Capital from a margin call. She illegally commingled client funds to purchase her own extravagant engagement ring. I cracked my knuckles, the sharp popping sound echoing loudly in the damp, quiet room. I opened a new, highly encrypted folder on my Ghost server. I titled it specifically with the federal statute code for severe attorney misconduct and financial embezzlement. I began extracting the raw, undeniable data. I pulled the exact timestamp logs showing Chloe bypassing the corporate firewall. I saved the digital signature packets proving she personally authorized the transfer of the stolen funds. I captured the routing hashes that linked the client escrow accounts directly to the Manhattan diamond importer and the commercial margin call in Brooklyn. This was no longer just a hostile divorce proceeding. This was a fully documented, indisputable federal crime scene. I opened a standardized Securities and Exchange Commission whistleblower template. My fingers flew across the keyboard, translating the complex offshore routing numbers and the escrow breaches into stark, undeniable visual charts. I detailed the precise mechanism Chloe used to illegally inflate Marcus's liquidity. I attached the metadata, proving she drafted her extortion documents on company time. I attached the escrow ledgers, proving she stole vulnerable client funds to buy personal jewelry. The resulting digital packet was a devastating 20-page execution order. The sheer density of the verified evidence guaranteed immediate federal intervention. If I hit the send button right now, the regulatory authorities would completely freeze Thorn Capital's accounts within hours. The Federal Bureau of Investigation would raid their executive offices before sunset. Chloe would be permanently disbarred, and Marcus would be placed in handcuffs. My right index finger hovered perfectly still over the trackpad. I stared intensely at the transmission button on the screen. Sending the file right now would deliver swift, brutal justice. It would end the harassment. It would immediately stop the relentless legal threats they were using to crush me. But it would also allow Marcus a dangerous sliver of survival. If I detonated the trap prematurely, he would immediately spin a public narrative of complete victimization. He would claim rogue employees had manipulated his corporate books without his knowledge. Chloe would become the designated sacrificial lamb, and he would play the shocked, betrayed managing partner. He would hire incredibly aggressive defense attorneys and drag the civil litigation out for years, shielding his personal wealth behind a massive wall of corporate deniability. I did not want a prolonged, messy legal battle. I wanted absolute, inescapable financial annihilation. I pulled my finger away from the trackpad. I saved the completed whistleblower packet directly to my encrypted offline hard drive. I locked the massive file with a 32-character alphanumeric passphrase, securing the digital explosive safely inside my own possession. I could not detonate the federal trap while Marcus still possessed the legal maneuvering room to distance himself from the firm's toxic liabilities. I needed to fundamentally alter the structural ownership of Thorn Capital. I needed him to claim sole, unencumbered responsibility for the holding company right before the federal authorities discovered the massive rot hidden inside it. I needed him to trap himself permanently under oath. I leaned back in the stiff wooden chair, the cheap plastic creaking loudly under my weight. I stared at the peeling yellow wallpaper of the motel room, a heavy, cold calm settling deep into my chest. The pieces were aligning with terrifying perfection. Marcus was desperately trying to force a total asset forfeiture agreement down my throat. He wanted me to sign away my legal rights to the marital estate and completely sever my ties to his venture capital firm. I reached over and touched the thick manila envelope Chloe had delivered earlier. I traced the edge of the unsigned extortion contract with my thumb. He wanted to own Thorn Capital entirely. I was going to give him exactly what he wanted. I was going to let him steal his own sinking ship, and I was going to watch him drown. I unlocked my secondary encrypted mobile device and opened the secure court portal. The official portable document format file loaded instantly. It was an emergency injunction. Marcus had weaponized his vast social capital and utilized a corrupt contact within the judicial scheduling office to entirely bypass months of standard legal delays. The bold black text at the very top of the digital summons dictated that our final divorce hearing was now officially scheduled for 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. I scrolled down through the densely packed legal clauses. Chloe Vanguard had drafted the accompanying motions with ruthless, aggressive precision, clearly utilizing Thorn Capital's legal templates. The document explicitly prohibited me from requesting any standard financial discovery. It placed a hard, immediate gag order on my ability to subpoena the venture capital firm's internal banking records or access our joint marital accounts prior to standing before the presiding judge. They were attempting to blindfold me by accelerating the timeline to tomorrow morning and legally locking me out of the equitable distribution discovery process. They intended to railroad me into total poverty. They expected me to walk into the Foley Square courthouse with zero financial evidence, zero legal representation, and zero leverage. They wanted to force me to sign the total asset forfeiture agreement under the immediate, crushing pressure of a sworn courtroom setting. A standard civilian facing an accelerated injunction of this magnitude would panic. A traditional divorce attorney would spend the next 12 hours frantically drafting an emergency stay of proceedings, begging the court clerk for a 90-day extension to properly review the complex marital estate. I did not panic. I stared at the glowing white screen of my mobile device, analyzing the strategic geometry of Marcus's maneuver. He believed he was slamming a heavy steel door shut on my fingers. He completely failed to realize he was actively locking himself inside a courtroom before he could secure emergency funding for his failing $120 million real estate project in Brooklyn. If the divorce hearing had remained 6 months away, Marcus would have possessed the necessary time to potentially restructure his toxic debt, launder more stolen funds, or find a new institutional investor to plug the massive holes in his sinking foundation by forcing the final asset division tomorrow morning. He was legally anchoring himself to the venture capital firm precisely when its internal architecture was most radioactive. I scrolled to the very bottom of the digital court summons. A blinking green icon offered two distinct legal choices: contest or accept. I moved my thumb over the glass screen. I pressed accept. The state court database registered my immediate compliance with a soft electronic chime. The expedited docket was now permanently locked. I set the mobile device down on the desk, my breathing slow and perfectly measured. I had just willingly agreed to step into his trap, ensuring he would arrive at the courthouse tomorrow morning overflowing with blind, intoxicating arrogance. Less than 2 minutes after my digital confirmation cleared the New York State servers. My secondary cellular phone vibrated aggressively against the laminate wood. The caller identification displayed Marcus's private number. He had been monitoring the court database in real time, waiting to see if I would attempt a desperate, futile legal block. I picked up the heavy device and swiped the green answer icon. I held the phone to my ear, maintaining a terrifying, unbroken silence. "You actually accepted the injunction," Marcus sneered, his voice vibrating with thick, heavy arrogance. I listened closely to the audio feed, detecting the faint, distinct clinking of crystal glasses in his background. They were already pouring celebratory drinks in the luxury penthouse I legally co-owned. "I always comply with court orders," I answered. Keeping my tone perfectly flat, Chloe let out a sharp, mocking laugh from somewhere close to his side, ensuring I could hear her presence. "You finally realized you cannot win," Marcus stated, projecting absolute victory. I stared at the peeling yellow wallpaper of the cheap motel room, keeping my pulse incredibly steady. He interpreted my strategic compliance as the ultimate manifestation of defeat. "I will see you tomorrow morning," I said quietly. "Bring the signed forfeiture agreement tomorrow," Marcus demanded, the cruel edge in his voice sharpening significantly. I heard the sound of liquid pouring, confirming he was actively intoxicating himself on his perceived supremacy. "Or I will ensure you pay my legal fees forever," he added, breathing heavily into the microphone. I ended the call with a swift press of my thumb. I set the device face down on the desk, severing his direct access to my reality. He mistook my legal silence for total, crushing surrender. He was celebrating his flawless victory with his mistress, entirely oblivious to the federal explosive I had just spent the last 10 hours meticulously constructing. I turned my attention back to my encrypted corporate laptop. The digital evidence required for tomorrow morning was fully assembled, but it needed to be weaponized through the correct physical channels. A forensic auditor cannot walk into a courtroom carrying only a flash drive. The judge required hard, undeniable paper trails. I opened the secure file containing the extracted metadata, proving Chloe drafted her extortion clauses on company servers. I reached into my leather briefcase and retrieved a specialized portable thermal printer. I connected the device to my laptop using a secure cable. I initiated the printing sequence. The small machine whirred quietly in the damp room, dispensing crisp white pages of undeniable federal evidence onto the cheap motel desk. I gathered the printed documents, aligning the sharp edges with meticulous precision. I stared at the barcode scans and the timestamp logs tying Chloe directly to severe attorney misconduct. I did not stop there. I printed the Delaware Shell Company ledgers detailing the exact routing numbers Sylvia Thorne utilized to wash my stolen $15 million. I printed the internal risk assessments of the failing tech hub project in Brooklyn, explicitly highlighting the catastrophic subterranean foundation delays and the massive municipal permit violations. Finally, I printed the client escrow transaction logs proving Chloe illegally commingled protected funds to purchase her diamond engagement ring and cover Marcus's emergency margin calls. I stacked the devastating financial intelligence into a single, dense pile. The paper felt heavy and substantial in my hands, a physical manifestation of their absolute ruin. I took a thick manila envelope from the bottom compartment of my briefcase and slid the documents inside. I sealed the flap with a firm, deliberate press of my thumb. I picked up the unsigned total asset forfeiture agreement Chloe had delivered earlier. I folded the 30-page extortion document perfectly in half and slid it into the side pocket of my briefcase. Marcus demanded I bring the paperwork to court tomorrow. I fully intended to bring it. I needed the document present so he could officially claim sole ownership of the venture capital firm right before I detonated its debt. I closed my encrypted laptop, waiting for the cooling fan to spin down into silence. I packed the machine away. I secured my crafting scalpel, my portable document scanner, and my untraceable emergency cash reserves, sliding each item into its designated leather loop. I zipped the heavy briefcase shut. The sharp metallic sound echoed loudly in the quiet, sterile room. The preparation phase was officially complete. Marcus had accelerated the legal timeline, attempting to crush me before I could mount a defense. Instead, he had simply forced me to execute my final maneuver under the cover of darkness. I possessed the routing numbers, the metadata, and the federal evidence. I had the exact blueprint of his $120 million toxic debt. But holding the blueprint was no longer sufficient. To trigger the final collapse in front of the presiding judge, I needed to legally own that debt by tomorrow morning. I needed to transition from being his discarded wife to becoming his primary commercial creditor. I pulled my damp wool trench coat off the rusted radiator. I slipped the heavy fabric over my shoulders, adjusting the collar against the chill of the room. I picked up my leather briefcase, the solid weight grounding me perfectly in the present moment. I walked out of the motel room, pulling the cheap wooden door shut until the iron deadbolt clicked firmly into place. I stepped out onto the freezing concrete walkway. The New York rain had slowed to a persistent, freezing drizzle, reflecting the harsh neon light of the vacancy sign. I walked down the metal stairs, my heels striking the pavement with rhythmic, unyielding precision. Marcus was sleeping comfortably in a penthouse. Believing his empire was secure, I was stepping into the darkness to meet a billionaire private equity titan, entirely prepared to execute the quiet, ruthless acquisition of my husband's entire reality. The drive from the decaying perimeter of Queens back into the financial heart of Manhattan was a blur of freezing rain and harsh neon lights reflecting off the flooded asphalt. I sat in the back of an anonymous transit car, keeping my wet wool trench coat pulled tightly against my shivering shoulders. I did not look at the passing skyline. I stared strictly at the heavy leather briefcase resting on my knees, my hands tracing the brass clasps. Inside that bag was the complete architectural blueprint of my husband's impending destruction. The transit car glided to a smooth halt in front of a towering skyscraper, composed entirely of dark obsidian glass and steel. It was the global headquarters of Croft Global Holdings. The street was completely deserted, the normal chaotic energy of the financial district entirely suppressed by the early morning hour and the violent winter storm. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked directly toward the massive revolving doors. There was no sleeping night watchman, The security perimeter of a billionaire private equity titan operated with lethal, military precision. Two men wearing tailored black suits and coiled tactical earpieces stepped directly into my path before my boots even touched the marble threshold. "State your business," the taller guard demanded, placing a heavy hand on my path. "Nathaniel Croft is expecting me," I answered quietly. The guard pressed 2 fingers against his earpiece, his eyes scanning my damp hair and ruined coat with intense suspicion. He listened for a fraction of a second before his rigid posture instantly dissolved. He stepped backward, swiping a security card against the glass barrier to manually unlock the primary doors. He pointed toward a specific private elevator bank tucked discreetly behind the main reception desk. I walked across the vast, empty lobby. My heels clicked sharply against the polished marble, the sound echoing into the cavernous ceiling. I pressed my palm against the biometric scanner panel beside the polished steel elevator doors. The machine emitted a soft green glow. Recognizing the security clearance Nathaniel had temporarily patched into the system, the heavy doors parted silently. I stepped inside the pristine cabin, and the elevator immediately initiated its rapid, uninterrupted ascent. I traveled 60 floors upward in complete silence. The ambient temperature in the cabin was perfectly regulated, slowly drying the damp wool of my coat. The steel doors slid open, revealing the executive war room of Croft Global Holdings. The space was a terrifying monument to absolute financial power. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered a panoramic view of the storm-battered city below, making the surrounding skyscrapers look incredibly small. The room was dominated by a massive, circular table carved from a single slab of petrified wood. Surrounding the table were banks of glowing monitors displaying live, cascading data feeds from international markets operating in different time zones. Nathaniel Croft sat at the head of the table. The 60-year-old titan wore a pristine white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, projecting a ruthless, nocturnal energy. He did not offer me a sympathetic smile or a cup of warm coffee. He understood that I was not there seeking comfort. "You look like you walked through a hurricane, Gianna," Nathaniel noted, his deep voice carrying flawlessly across the expansive room. "I walked through a hostile lockout," I replied, setting my heavy briefcase onto the petrified wood. Nathaniel stood up, the leather of his executive chair creaking loudly in the quiet room. He walked over to the nearest bank of monitors and tapped a sequence of keys. A highly detailed financial schematic materialized across 3 massive screens. I recognized the formatting immediately. It was the primary commercial debt portfolio of Thorn Capital. "Your husband is currently executing a spectacular financial suicide," Nathaniel stated flatly, pointing a finger at a glowing red graph. I unlatched my briefcase and stepped closer to the monitors, my eyes scanning the raw numbers. "The Brooklyn Tech Hub is actively collapsing," I confirmed, watching the catastrophic deficit ratios updating in real time. "It is worse than a simple collapse," Nathaniel corrected, resting his hands on the polished table. "The primary commercial bank holding his $120 million construction loan is panicking. They sent internal risk assessors to the site yesterday afternoon. They discovered the subterranean foundation failures and the massive municipal permit violations." My jaw tightened. The primary lender was finally looking beneath the surface of Marcus's fabricated balance sheets. "The bank realizes Thorn Capital cannot sustain the construction delays," Nathaniel continued, his eyes locking onto mine. "They know Marcus will officially default before the end of the fiscal quarter. They want to completely scrub this toxic liability off their ledgers before it triggers a catastrophic regulatory audit." I stared at the glowing red numbers, my pulse settling into a slow, rhythmic beat. In the ruthless world of commercial banking, institutions frequently sold their distressed, high-risk loans to secondary debt collectors at a steep discount to salvage whatever immediate liquidity they could extract. They were willing to take a massive loss just to pass the explosive liability to someone else. "They are looking to offload the paper tonight," I whispered, the final puzzle piece sliding perfectly into place. "They are quietly shopping the $120 million note to institutional buyers," Nathaniel confirmed, turning back to face me. "They are offering a severe discount. They will hand over the entire debt portfolio for $40 million in liquid cash just to close the ledger before morning. Marcus was currently sleeping in his luxury penthouse, entirely unaware that the foundation of his venture capital firm was being secretly peddled on the midnight clearance racks of Wall Street. He believed he had successfully secured his empire by stealing $15 million of my marital assets to cover a temporary margin call. He had no idea his primary lender was actively abandoning ship. "Buy it," I instructed, my voice completely devoid of hesitation. Nathaniel raised a single, gray eyebrow. He crossed his arms tightly across his chest, evaluating the sheer audacity of my command. "You are asking me to inject $40 million into a sinking ship," Nathaniel countered, his tone hardening into a protective, corporate shield. "I am not asking for your charity, Nathaniel," I answered smoothly. Opening my leather briefcase and pulling out my encrypted corporate laptop, "I am asking for your proxy architecture." I set my machine onto the petrified wood table and connected it directly to his primary routing hub. I bypassed his internal security protocols and accessed my own heavily concealed offshore digital vaults. Over the past decade, acting as a senior director of mergers and acquisitions, I had structured highly lucrative corporate blind trusts. I had quietly amassed significant, untouchable independent wealth entirely disconnected from the joint marital accounts Marcus had so eagerly drained. "I possess the required $40 million in untraceable liquid capital," I stated, tapping my keyboard to bring my hidden ledgers onto the primary screen. "But the commercial bank will not sell a toxic asset of this magnitude to an independent civilian holding company. They require an institutional buyer to legally assume the risk." Nathaniel leaned over my shoulder, analyzing the pristine verification codes of my offshore liquidity. A slow, terrifying smile spread across his weathered face. "You want to use my corporate shell as a digital Trojan horse," Nathaniel murmured, grasping the sheer brilliance of the strategy. "I will transfer my capital into your institutional clearinghouse," I explained, pulling up the necessary digital routing contracts. "You will execute the purchase of Thorn Capital's debt portfolio under the Croft Global banner. Once the transaction clears the federal banking regulators, you will immediately assign the absolute ownership of the debt directly to my private limited liability company." It was a flawless, invisible acquisition. By utilizing Nathaniel's massive corporate weight, the primary bank would eagerly authorize the sale, believing they were handing the toxic loan over to a billionaire private equity firm. They would never look past the initial proxy to see the discarded, humiliated wife standing directly behind the curtain. "Execute the transfer," Nathaniel commanded, stepping back to give me absolute control of the terminal. I cracked my knuckles, the joints popping sharply in the hushed, cavernous room. I initiated the wire transfers, watching my independent wealth flow across international borders with ruthless efficiency. The capital merged seamlessly into the Croft Global holding accounts. Nathaniel stepped forward, utilizing his biometric clearance to authorize the official bid on the open distressed debt market. The digital clock mounted on the far wall of the war room shifted quietly. It was exactly 1:45 in the morning. We stood shoulder to shoulder, staring at the massive primary monitor. The screen displayed a complex loading matrix as the commercial bank's automated underwriting software analyzed the sudden $40 million bid. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the massive cooling servers hidden behind the walls. My hands rested flat against the polished edge of the table. I visualized Marcus sitting in his bespoke suit at the charity gala, laughing as his mother mocked my working-class background. I visualized Chloe standing on the freezing concrete walkway outside my motel room, shoving an extortion document against my chest. They desperately wanted to own Thorn Capital. They wanted to steal my life savings to protect their elite status. The loading matrix on the screen suddenly collapsed. A bright, glaring green confirmation banner flashed across the entirety of the monitor. The transaction was complete. The Federal Clearinghouse verified the transfer of funds. "The paper is officially yours, Gianna," Nathaniel whispered, pulling a physical copy of the debt assignment from the secure laser printer humming in the corner. He walked over and handed me a single sheet of heavy cardstock. It was a perfected notice of absolute assignment of debt. I held the document in my hands, tracing the stark black ink. The digital clock on the wall shifted to exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. The entire power dynamic of my reality had just fundamentally altered. 30 minutes ago, I was a stranded wife fighting to survive a hostile lockout. Now, I was the sole proprietor of a $120 million commercial debt portfolio. I legally owned the very earth Marcus Thorne walked upon. I was no longer his victim. I was his absolute primary creditor, holding the unchecked power of immediate, catastrophic foreclosure over his entire empire. I folded the heavy document perfectly in half. I slid it into a thick manila envelope and tucked it securely into the side compartment of my leather briefcase. He accelerated the divorce hearing to 9 o'clock this morning, I noted, sealing the brass clasps of the bag with a sharp click. He intends to force you to sign away your assets under the threat of federal perjury, Nathaniel observed, walking me toward the frosted glass doors of the war room. He intends to claim sole ownership of the venture capital firm, I corrected, pulling my damp trench coat tightly around my shoulders. I am going to let him swear under oath that he owns the company. I am going to let him lock himself inside the burning building before I officially lock the doors. I stepped back into the private elevator. The heavy steel doors slid shut, sealing the quiet power of the war room away. I descended back down to the lobby, stepping out into the freezing New York rain. The storm was still raging, but I no longer felt the cold. I hailed a passing taxi, my mind entirely focused on the impending sunrise. Marcus wanted a final confrontation in a sworn courtroom. I was entirely prepared to give him an execution. The freezing drizzle from the previous night had crystallized into a biting morning frost. I stood at the base of the massive granite steps leading up to the Foley Square courthouse, the heavy leather briefcase anchored firmly in my right hand. The towering Corinthian columns cast long, imposing shadows across the cracked concrete plaza. I wore a plain, slate-gray wool suit, a deliberate and calculated choice to project the image of a financially depleted wife holding on to the very last threads of her dignity. I did not have to wait long for the spectacle to begin. A pristine black Rolls-Royce glided smoothly up to the curb, the heavy engine purring with aggressive, unadulterated wealth. A hired chauffeur immediately stepped out, rushing to open the rear passenger door. Marcus emerged first, adjusting the lapels of a custom-tailored obsidian suit that cost more than the average annual salary of the pedestrians walking past him. Chloe followed a second later, draping a luxurious white cashmere coat over her shoulders. The massive radiant-cut diamond engagement ring glittered violently in the harsh morning sunlight as she linked her arm through his. They walked up the granite steps with the synchronized, arrogant stride of conquering royalty. They did not look like two people preparing for a contentious divorce hearing. They looked like predators arriving at a slaughterhouse to collect their prize. I turned my back to the icy wind and walked through the heavy revolving glass doors, letting the chaotic, echoing noise of the courthouse lobby swallow me entirely. I bypassed the crowded security checkpoints, utilizing my priority attorney clearance credentials, moving smoothly past the long lines of miserable civilians. I took the grand marble staircase to the 3rd floor, my heels clicking in a slow, rhythmic cadence against the polished stone. The corridor outside courtroom 3 was largely empty, characterized by towering oak doors and pale, echoing marble walls. I stopped near a row of heavy wooden benches, setting my briefcase down on the cold floor. Heavy. Purposeful footsteps echoed down the corridor behind me. I did not turn around. I kept my breathing perfectly measured, pulling the stale, institutional air deep into my lungs. Marcus stepped directly into my peripheral vision, intentionally invading my physical space. Chloe flanked him on the right, her chin tilted upward in a mask of absolute condescension. "You actually showed up," Marcus sneered, his voice vibrating with thick, heavy arrogance. I turned my head slowly, meeting his gaze with an entirely dead, clinical expression. "I always comply with court summons," I answered quietly. Chloe let out a sharp, mocking laugh, her manicured fingers aggressively brushing a piece of invisible lint off his tailored shoulder. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on the modest, unassuming fabric of my slate-gray suit. "You look completely exhausted, Gianna," Chloe mocked, a cruel smile stretching across her face. I did not flinch. I did not look at the stolen diamond on her finger. I focused entirely on the microscopic twitch of a vein pulsing rapidly in Marcus's neck. He was projecting supreme confidence, but his physiological responses betrayed a desperate, underlying urgency. He needed the $120 million toxic debt hidden safely off his personal ledgers, and he needed my stolen marital capital to cover his impending balloon payment. He needed total, unencumbered ownership of the venture capital firm before 9 o'clock. "I do not have time for your pathetic games today," Marcus stated, stepping closer until the toes of his polished leather shoes nearly touched mine. He reached into the breast pocket of his custom jacket. He pulled out the exact same thick manila envelope Chloe had shoved against my chest at the cheap motel yesterday. He ripped the flap open and pulled out the 30-page total asset forfeiture agreement. He held it out, shoving the dense legal document directly into my line of sight. "You have exactly 5 minutes to sign this," Marcus demanded, his jaw clenching with barely suppressed rage. "I am reviewing the stipulations," I replied flatly, refusing to take the paper from his hands. Marcus let out a loud, aggressive scoff, looking frantically around the empty marble corridor to ensure there were no witnesses to his extortion. He leaned down, lowering his voice into a harsh, venomous whisper intended to completely shatter my psychological resolve. "There is absolutely nothing left to review," Marcus threatened, his breath hot against my cheek. "You have zero leverage, Gianna." I stared directly into his eyes, keeping my pulse locked into a slow, steady rhythm. "If you walk into that courtroom without signing this agreement," Marcus continued, his tone dripping with absolute malice, "I will ensure you pay my corporate legal fees forever." Chloe reached into her cashmere coat and produced a heavy silver pen. She clicked the top with a sharp, echoing snap. She held it out toward me, offering it like a weapon. "Take the $10,000 relocation fee and disappear," Chloe commanded, her eyes narrowing into dark slits. They desperately wanted me to break. They expected me to weep, to beg for a larger settlement, or to scream loudly about the blatant illegality of their coercion. They anticipated a frantic, emotional meltdown right here in the courthouse hallway. They assumed the crushing weight of impending poverty and the terrifying threat of endless corporate litigation would force me into total, blinding submission. I looked at the heavy silver pen in Chloe's hand, then I looked at the smug, victorious expression plastered across my husband's face. I felt a slow, chilling wave of predatory satisfaction wash through my chest. My heart beat with a steady, terrifying calm. This was the exact moment I had spent the entire night engineering. I reached out and took the heavy silver pen from Chloe's manicured fingers. The metal was freezing cold against my skin. I did not say a single word. I snatched the 30-page total asset forfeiture agreement directly out of Marcus's hand. I turned my back on them and walked over to the pale, polished marble wall of the corridor. I pressed the thick stack of legal documents flat against the cold stone. I bypassed the aggressive liability waivers, the non-disclosure clauses, and the pathetic $10,000 relocation fee. I flipped directly to the final signature page. My eyes scanned the specific paragraph Chloe had drafted with such malicious precision. The clause explicitly stated that by signing this document, I was legally surrendering my entire 50% marital stake in Thorn Capital, transferring 100% of the venture capital holding company solely and exclusively to Marcus Thorn. I braced my left hand against the marble wall, holding the heavy paper perfectly still. I brought the silver pen to the signature line. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I pressed the ink against the paper and signed my full legal name with flawless, unyielding precision. I executed the stroke with the absolute certainty of an executioner dropping a heavy guillotine blade. I capped the silver pen with a sharp click. I turned around and faced my husband. I held the signed contract out toward his chest. "The firm is officially yours," I stated, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion. Marcus snatched the heavy document out of my hand with frantic, predatory speed. He immediately flipped to the final page, his eyes locking onto my fresh, black ink signature. A massive, triumphant smile exploded across his face. He let out a loud, arrogant breath of relief, his rigid posture instantly dissolving into a stance of absolute, untouchable supremacy. He looked at Chloe, flashing her a look of pure, unadulterated victory. She smirked, wrapping her arm tightly around his waist, firmly believing they had just successfully stolen my entire life savings and completely neutralized my existence. Marcus folded the document, sliding the execution order safely back into the breast pocket of his tailored suit. He looked back at me, his eyes filled with mocking, pathetic pity. He truly believed he had just legally severed me from his millions. He had absolutely no idea that less than 7 hours ago, seated in a billionaire's corporate war room, I had executed the quiet, invisible acquisition of his primary commercial lender. He failed to comprehend the catastrophic gravity of the signature he had just forced me to provide. By legally demanding and accepting 100% sole ownership of Thorn Capital, he had just formally assumed 100% personal, unencumbered liability for the firm's massive $120 million toxic debt. He thought he was locking me out of his lucrative empire. He failed to realize he had just voluntarily locked himself inside a burning building, and I was the one holding the match. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 3 suddenly unlatched with a loud, metallic clack. A uniformed bailiff stepped out into the marble corridor, holding a thick clipboard. "The Honorable Judge Aris is ready for you," the bailiff announced loudly. Marcus adjusted his silk tie, his chest puffed out with blinding, intoxicating arrogance. "Let us finish this," Marcus commanded, walking past me without a second glance. Chloe followed closely behind him, the stolen diamonds catching the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom entrance. I watched them step over the threshold, marching confidently toward the judge's bench. I reached down and picked up my heavy leather briefcase, the printed offshore routing numbers, the extracted metadata logs, the federal escrow embezzlement proof, and the official notice of absolute debt assignment rested securely inside the lining. I adjusted the collar of my slate gray suit. I stepped forward, walking directly into the sworn courtroom, entirely prepared to watch my husband realize he was a dead man. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 3 swung shut behind me, sealing away the chaotic echoing noise of the marble corridor. The interior of the chamber was a masterclass in austere, intimidating authority. Dark mahogany paneling lined the walls, absorbing the harsh fluorescent light overhead. I walked deliberately down the center aisle, my heels striking the polished wooden floor with a slow, rhythmic cadence. I bypassed the crowded gallery and took my seat entirely alone at the respondent table. I placed my heavy leather briefcase squarely onto the scratched wooden surface, resting my hands flat against the cold brass clasps. Marcus sat at the petitioner table just a few feet away. He leaned back in his tufted leather chair, exuding an intoxicating, blinding arrogance. Chloe sat directly beside him, acting as his primary legal counsel. She arranged a stack of thick manila folders with her manicured fingers, the stolen diamond on her left hand catching the harsh overhead light. They did not look like two people preparing for a contentious divorce proceeding. They looked like predators waiting to carve up a helpless carcass. A heavy side door opened, and Judge Thomas Aris stepped up to the elevated bench. He was a stern, uncompromising magistrate with 30 years of jurisprudence carved deeply into the rigid lines of his face. The bailiff slammed a wooden gavel against a sounding block, the sharp crack snapping the room into absolute silence. "All rise," the uniformed bailiff commanded, scanning the quiet room. We stood in perfect unison. Judge Aris settled into his high-backed leather chair, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses before looking down at the preliminary docket. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He operated a brutally efficient courtroom, prioritizing hard evidence over emotional grievances. "Call your first witness," Judge Aris instructed, staring directly at Chloe. "We call Marcus Thorne." Chloe answered smoothly, a victorious smile stretching across her lips. Marcus stood up, buttoning his custom-tailored obsidian suit jacket. He strode confidently across the well of the courtroom and stepped up into the wooden witness box. The bailiff approached him, holding a worn leather Bible. Marcus placed his right hand firmly flat against the cover, raising his left hand into the air. "Do you swear to tell the truth?" the bailiff asked, holding a printed card. "I do," Marcus replied, his voice vibrating with absolute, unadulterated confidence. He took his seat, adjusting the microphone positioned in front of him. He looked out across the courtroom, his eyes briefly meeting mine. He expected to see blinding panic. He expected to see the crushing weight of impending poverty breaking my spirit. I offered him absolutely nothing. I sat perfectly still, my breathing regulated to a slow, methodical rhythm. Chloe stepped out from behind the petitioner table, holding a crisp stack of printed documents. She approached the witness box with the calculated strut of a woman who believed she had already won the war. "Please state your occupation for the record," Chloe prompted, leaning against the wooden railing. "I am the managing partner of Thorne Capital," Marcus stated proudly, puffing out his chest. "And how would you describe the current financial health of your firm?" Chloe asked, handing him the top document from her stack. Marcus took the paper, holding it up for the judge to see. It was a flawlessly fabricated corporate balance sheet, engineered specifically for this exact moment. He had spent weeks hiding his catastrophic toxic debt behind layers of Delaware shell companies, stripping the liability entirely off his personal ledgers. "The firm is highly liquid and exceptionally profitable." Marcus perjured himself smoothly, not a single muscle twitching in his face. I kept my eyes locked onto his jawline. I did not object to his blatant lie. I watched the court reporter sitting just below the judge bench. Her fingers danced frantically across the keys of her stenograph machine, translating his spoken deceit into a permanent, legally binding transcript. "Did your wife contribute to this financial success?" Chloe questioned, her tone dripping with manufactured pity. "She contributed absolutely nothing," Marcus answered, letting out a soft, mocking scoff. He leaned forward, gripping the edges of the wooden witness box. He was actively enjoying the performance. He relished the opportunity to dismantle my value in a sworn public forum. He wanted to strip away my decade of massive financial contributions and reduce me to a desperate, gold-digging parasite. "Gianna operated a minor compliance consultancy," Marcus continued, his chin tilting upward in pure arrogance. "I provided all the foundational capital for our lifestyle." My jaw tightened slightly, a dull ache radiating up into my temples. The audacity of his perjury was staggering. I had personally saved his family from catastrophic bankruptcy just hours ago by absorbing his $120 million commercial liability. Yet here he sat, under oath, claiming I was nothing but a financial burden. I did not raise my voice to argue. I did not stand up and scream about the $15 million he had stolen from my marital accounts to cover his failing tech hub project in Brooklyn. A traditional civilian would have interrupted the proceeding, demanding immediate justice. A traditional divorce attorney would have raised a dozen loud, frantic objections. I mentally repeated the single phrase that governed my entire existence. I do not argue. I audit. I let him speak. Every single word he uttered was another heavy iron bar locking him permanently inside his own cage. "Is Thorne Capital entirely separate from your marital assets?" Chloe asked, guiding him toward the final trap. "It is my sole, unencumbered asset," Marcus confirmed, staring directly into the judge's eyes, "built entirely by my own labor." Chloe walked back to the petitioner table and picked up the thick manila envelope Marcus had forced me to sign in the marble hallway. She pulled out the 30-page total asset forfeiture agreement. She presented the document to Judge Aris, pointing a manicured finger directly at my fresh black ink signature on the final page. "Your Honor, we submit this finalized forfeiture," Chloe announced, handing a copy to the bailiff. Judge Aris adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, scanning the dense legal clauses. He looked down at me, his bushy gray eyebrows drawing together in a tight, confused frown. You signed away all marital equity, Ms. Croft, Judge Arris asked, genuine surprise breaking his stern demeanor. I signed the document this morning, I answered quietly, keeping my hands flat against my briefcase. Marcus let out a loud, arrogant breath of relief. His rigid posture instantly dissolved into a stance of absolute, untouchable supremacy. He believed the battle was officially over by verifying my signature on the forfeiture agreement. The judge was legally validating absolute ownership of the venture capital firm for Marcus. Does this document reflect your intent, Mr. Thorne? Judge Arris inquired, holding the paper up. I accept 100% sole ownership of Thorne Capital, Marcus declared under oath, his voice ringing across the silent courtroom. The court reporter struck the final keys on her machine, locking his declaration permanently into the court record. The legal severance was officially complete. Marcus had just sworn before a presiding judge that I possessed absolutely zero equity in his corporate empire. He had formally stripped me of any remaining liability or connection to his business operations. He thought he was building a massive concrete wall to lock me out of his millions. He completely failed to realize that he had just wrapped his arms tightly around a sinking anchor. By legally demanding and claiming 100% sole ownership of Thorne Capital, he had just voluntarily assumed 100% personal, unencumbered liability for the firm's massive toxic debt. He could not blame a partner. He could not claim marital commingling. He was standing alone on the trapdoor, and he had just gleefully tied the noose around his own neck. Do you have any cross-examination, Ms. Croft? Judge Arris asked, looking down at my empty table. He expected me to ask for a recess. He expected me to beg for spousal support or challenge the aggressive relocation fee. He looked at my plain slate gray suit and saw a defeated, destitute woman who had just surrendered her entire life savings. I unlatched the heavy brass clasps of my leather briefcase. The sharp metallic clicks echoed loudly through the silent chamber. I do have a few questions for my husband, I stated smoothly. I stood up from the respondent table, my heels planting firmly against the polished wooden floor. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the thick stack of undeniable federal evidence I had meticulously printed in the cheap motel room. I felt the dense, physical weight of the extracted metadata logs, the federal escrow embezzlement proof, and the official notice of absolute debt assignment. Marcus frowned, a tiny microscopic flicker of confusion breaking his arrogant facade. He watched me step out from behind the wooden table. He thought he was about to face a bitter, emotional wife seeking a pathetic moral victory. I walked toward the witness box, entirely prepared to introduce my husband to his new primary commercial creditor. I stepped onto the elevated wooden platform of the witness box. The varnished oak railing felt solid and cold beneath my fingertips. Before I could even adjust the small black microphone positioned in front of me, Chloe launched her final offensive. She did not return to her seat at the petitioner table. She paced directly into the center of the courtroom well, her expensive leather heels clicking sharply against the polished floorboards. She wanted to dictate the momentum, rushing the judge before the ink on my signature could fully dry. Your Honor, we petition for immediate execution, Chloe declared, gesturing aggressively toward the signed document resting on the bench. Judge Arris looked down through his wire-rimmed glasses, his gray eyebrows knitting together in minor irritation at her aggressive pacing. He tapped his heavy silver pen against a stack of preliminary dockets, his face an unreadable mask of judicial fatigue. The respondent has surrendered all equitable claims, Chloe continued, her voice rising to fill the cavernous mahogany chamber. She walked closer to the bench, her posture rigid with blinding arrogance. She cast a fleeting, venomous glare in my direction. She wanted to ensure I was completely neutralized, permanently stripped of any ability to retaliate or expose the vast financial rot festering beneath her pristine engagement ring. She viewed me as a defeated insect, entirely crushed beneath the heel of her superior corporate maneuvering. We request a permanent gag order, Chloe demanded, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. My breathing remained perfectly regulated. I did not shift my weight or clutch the wooden railing in terror. I let the oppressive silence hang in the air, forcing her to fully articulate her extortion in front of a sworn presiding judge. "The respondent possesses intimate knowledge of proprietary operations," Chloe explained, spinning a flawless web of legal paranoia. She looked back at Marcus. He nodded approvingly, his chest puffed out under his custom obsidian suit. He loved watching his mistress dismantle my professional identity in open court. A vein pulsed rapidly in his neck, betraying the desperate, underlying urgency fueling his confident facade. "A non-disclosure mandate is absolutely necessary," Chloe argued, returning her attention to the judge, "to prevent her from maliciously disparaging Thorn Capital." They were terrified. Beneath the smug smirks and the tailored suits, a frantic, desperate fear drove their every maneuver. They knew I was a senior forensic auditor. They knew my mind was an impenetrable vault of their operational methodologies. They needed a court-ordered gag to silence me forever, ensuring I could never alert the Securities and Exchange Commission to the illegal escrow commingling or the catastrophic foundation failures dragging their tech hub project into the mud. They thought a piece of paper signed by a family court judge would serve as a bulletproof shield against their massive federal wire fraud. Judge Aris leaned back in his high-backed leather chair, analyzing the aggressive request. Family courts routinely issued non-disclosure agreements during high-net-worth divorces to protect highly sensitive corporate trade secrets. He looked away from Chloe and shifted his stern, uncompromising gaze directly onto me. He expected me to fight. He expected me to unleash a frantic, emotional tirade about my stolen marital assets or scream about the fundamental unfairness of the oppressive gag order. "Does the respondent object?" Judge Aris inquired, his tone heavy with absolute judicial authority. I looked across the well of the courtroom. Marcus was practically vibrating with toxic anticipation. He leaned forward in his tufted leather chair, a cruel, mocking smile stretching across his strong jaw. He wanted to watch me beg. He wanted the public validation of my complete, unmitigated defeat. He craved the satisfaction of seeing me completely broken. I turned my eyes back to the presiding magistrate. My pulse beat in a slow, rhythmic, terrifying cadence. "I do not object, Your Honor," I answered, keeping my voice entirely devoid of panic. Marcus let out a sharp, audible scoff of triumph. He slumped back into his chair, crossing his arms over his chest in a posture of total supremacy. Chloe mirrored his victory, flashing a bright, predatory smirk as she finally retreated to the petitioner table. They assumed they had just won the war. They believed they had permanently locked the doors to their fraudulent empire, securing the keys and throwing away the combination forever. They completely failed to realize that they had just demanded the court legally isolate them inside a sinking submarine. "I fully agree to the absolute forfeiture," I stated, my words ringing clearly through the silent mahogany chamber. Judge Aris frowned, clearly unsettled by my total lack of resistance. It defied every instinct of human self-preservation to willingly surrender millions of dollars in marital equity and accept a permanent gag order without a single word of debate. It was highly irregular, and his judicial instincts immediately sensed a hidden structural flaw. "You understand the finality of this agreement," Judge Aris warned, leaning heavily forward over the elevated bench. "I understand completely," I replied smoothly, gripping the wooden railing. "My husband claims 100% sole ownership, and he assumes all subsequent liabilities," Judge Aris confirmed, referencing the dense legal clauses Chloe had drafted with such malicious intent. "That is exactly my understanding," I noted, a cold, predatory thrill radiating deep within my chest. I stepped down from the elevated wooden witness box. I did not walk back to the respondent table to retrieve a tissue or weep desperately into my hands. I moved with deliberate, unrelenting precision. I reached into my heavy leather briefcase and retrieved the thick, densely packed manila envelope I had meticulously assembled in the cheap motel room before sunrise. The heavy brass clasps of the bag clicked shut, the metallic sound echoing sharply across the quiet room. The envelope felt incredibly heavy in my hands. It was the physical manifestation of their absolute destruction. It contained the thermal prints of the Delaware Shell Company ledgers, tracing the $15 million Marcus had stolen directly into his failing Brooklyn Tech Hub project. It contained the extracted server metadata logs, definitively proving Chloe had utilized corporate resources to commit federal extortion on company time. It contained the heavily encrypted client escrow ledgers, mathematically demonstrating how Chloe had embezzled protected funds to purchase her radiant-cut diamond ring and cover Marcus's emergency margin calls. And most importantly, it contained the perfected notice of absolute debt assignment, legally verifying that Nathaniel Croft had proxy purchased the $120 million commercial loan on my behalf at 2 o'clock this morning. I walked directly toward the bench, bypassing Chloe and Marcus entirely. My heels struck the polished floorboards with an unyielding, synchronized rhythm. "I accept the forfeiture and the gag order," I repeated, stopping just before the uniformed bailiff. I held the thick manila envelope suspended in the cold, conditioned air of the courtroom. "Provided the court reviews one final disclosure," I stated quietly. Chloe rolled her eyes, letting out a loud, theatrical sigh of pure exhaustion. She leaned over and whispered something directly into Marcus's ear. He chuckled, a low, arrogant sound that vibrated obnoxiously through the silent courtroom. They assumed the thick envelope contained a pathetic, desperate plea for a minor alimony stipend. They believed it was a stack of utility bills or cheap rent estimates, a humiliating request for the judge to marginally increase my $10,000 relocation fee so I would not end up sleeping on the freezing New York pavement tonight. They were laughing openly at what they perceived as my final, pathetic gasp for judicial mercy. "Hand it to the bailiff," Judge Aris instructed, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses with a slow, skeptical motion. I extended my arm. The uniformed bailiff stepped forward, his heavy boots scuffing the floor as he took the heavy manila envelope from my hands. He carried it up the short wooden steps and placed it squarely onto the judge's polished mahogany desk. I did not return to the empty respondent table. I stood perfectly still in the exact center of the courtroom well, my hands resting lightly at my sides. I focused my entire unblinking attention on the magistrate. I watched his weathered hands reach for the top flap of the sealed envelope. I watched him slide his silver letter opener beneath the heavy paper seam, slicing it open with a crisp, echoing, tearing sound. Marcus leaned comfortably back in his tufted chair, stretching his long legs out under the petitioner table. He was the absolute picture of a conqueror, surveying his freshly acquired kingdom. He had sworn under oath that Thorn Capital was exceptionally liquid and highly profitable. He had sworn that I contributed absolutely nothing to his financial success. He had successfully manipulated the entire judicial system to legally sever me from his vast empire. He was completely oblivious to the fact that his empire was currently being unraveled, page by printed page, right in front of his arrogant eyes. Judge Aris pulled the thick stack of pristine white documents from the heavy envelope. He placed them flat on his desk, flattening the creases with his palm, and began to read. He did not look at pathetic alimony clauses or desperate relocation fee requests, because there were none. He looked at the stark, undeniable offshore routing numbers. He looked at the complex forensic flowcharts detailing the massive, unmitigated corporate theft. The silence in the courtroom stretched into a suffocating, unbearable eternity. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the antique brass clock mounted on the far wall and the sharp rustle of thick paper as Judge Aris turned the first devastating page. I kept my eyes locked on the judge, waiting for the exact moment the realization hit him. I waited for the seasoned magistrate to comprehend that the man sitting in his courtroom, radiating smug arrogance, was not a successful venture capitalist. He was a desperate, over-leveraged criminal who had just voluntarily claimed sole, unencumbered responsibility for a catastrophic mountain of toxic commercial debt. I stood my ground, my breathing slow and steady, entirely prepared to execute the final maneuver. I kept my hands resting flat against my sides, my posture perfectly rigid. watching the seasoned magistrate scan the dense stack of documents. Marcus leaned back in his tufted leather chair, crossing his ankles lazily beneath the petitioner table. He exuded an intoxicating, blinding arrogance, entirely convinced that the pages contained a desperate, pathetic plea for a minor alimony stipend. Chloe sat directly beside him, tapping her manicured fingernails against the wooden surface, the stolen radiant-cut diamond catching the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights overhead. They both stared at the judge, waiting for him to dismiss my final disclosure with a condescending wave of his hand and formalize their absolute, undeniable victory. They did not realize they were watching the fuse burn rapidly down to the explosive. Judge Aris flipped to the second page, his bushy gray eyebrows knitted together in a tight, confused frown. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, pulling the document significantly closer to his face. He was a man who had spent 30 years presiding over high-net-worth divorces. He was highly accustomed to petty squabbles over vacation homes and hidden offshore bank accounts. He was not accustomed to reviewing a perfectly engineered corporate execution. The cynical boredom completely vanished from the magistrate's weathered face. His eyes widened, darting rapidly across the stark, undeniable offshore routing numbers and the complex forensic flowcharts detailing the massive, unmitigated corporate theft Marcus had so desperately tried to bury. He flipped to the extracted server metadata logs, tracing the exact timestamp Chloe had utilized to commit federal extortion on company time. Then, he reached the final 2 documents in the stack. The silence in the room stretched until it felt as though the oxygen had been entirely sucked from the chamber. Judge Aris stared at the perfected Uniform Commercial Code financing statement. He read the official notice of absolute assignment of debt. He reviewed the signatures bearing the authorized, unassailable seal of Croft Global Holdings. The profound realization of what had just transpired in his courtroom hit him with the force of a physical blow. Judge Aris let out a sudden, booming laugh. The sound was shocking, a loud, genuine burst of absolute disbelief that shattered the heavy tension of the room. It was not a professional, contained chuckle. It was a visceral, astonishing roar from a man who had just witnessed a flawless, lethal checkmate executed directly under his nose. Marcus flinched violently. His custom-tailored obsidian suit shifted as he dropped his feet flat onto the floor, his arrogant posture instantly dissolving. He looked at the judge, a tiny, microscopic flicker of blind panic breaking his smug facade. "Is there a problem, Your Honor?" Chloe asked, her jaw tightening as she stared up at the bench. Judge Aris did not answer her immediately. He wiped a tear of pure amusement from the corner of his eye, shaking his head slowly as he looked down at me. The stern, uncompromising magistrate viewed me with a sudden, profound respect. He placed the heavy documents flat onto his desk and folded his weathered hands securely over them. "Ms. Croft," Judge Aris said, leaning heavily forward, "please explain this disclosure." "I would be delighted," I answered, my tone remaining entirely cold and clinical. I turned slowly on my heels, facing my husband. Marcus swallowed hard, the thick vein in his neck pulsing with rapid, erratic anxiety. He looked at the dense stack of papers resting under the judge's hands, desperately trying to calculate the variables he had missed during his frantic push for a speedy trial. "The primary commercial lender offloaded the toxic liability," I stated, pacing one slow, deliberate step toward him. Marcus gripped the edges of the petitioner table. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent white. He knew the massive commercial loan was dragging Thorn Capital into a catastrophic deficit, but he firmly believed he had temporarily stabilized the bleeding by stealing $15 million of my marital assets to cover his impending margin call. "They authorized the distressed sale," I continued, maintaining absolute, unwavering eye contact. Chloe stood up abruptly. "This is completely irrelevant," Chloe objected, her chair scraping loudly against the polished wooden floorboards. "The respondent has signed a total asset forfeiture." "It is entirely relevant," Judge Aris countered, slamming his heavy silver pen against the desk. "Sit down, counselor." Chloe slowly lowered herself back into her chair, her chest heaving as the sheer terror of the unknown gripped her. She looked at Marcus, but he was completely paralyzed, his bloodshot eyes locked entirely onto my face. The digital proxy acquisition was flawless. Once the transaction cleared the federal banking regulators, the absolute ownership of the debt was immediately assigned to a private limited liability company. I paused, letting the silence stretch, forcing him to absorb the crushing weight of the incoming blow. "I own that company, Marcus," I whispered, my voice slicing through the heavy air like a scalpel. Marcus stopped breathing, his mouth opened slightly, but his vocal cords were completely paralyzed. He stared at me, his mind actively shattering as the impossible equation finally connected. He tried to process the sheer, astronomical magnitude of the midnight acquisition. "I am the sole, primary creditor," I stated, delivering the final, lethal strike. The entire courtroom seemed to tilt violently on its axis. The court reporter stopped typing, her fingers hovering motionless over the keys of her stenograph machine. The uniformed bailiff stared at me with wide, undisguised shock. Marcus grabbed his chest, his fingers clawing at the expensive silk fabric of his tie. He realized the fatal trap he had just gleefully locked himself inside. "You demanded an accelerated injunction," I said, my tone completely devoid of mercy. He had deliberately isolated me, froze my personal accounts, and forced me to sign a total asset forfeiture under the threat of fabricated federal perjury. He strictly demanded that this court legally sever me from Thorn Capital. "She surrendered the holding company," Chloe stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the bench. "I absolutely did," I agreed, a slow, predatory satisfaction settling deep into my chest. Moments ago, under penalty of perjury, Marcus swore that Thorn Capital was highly liquid and exceptionally profitable. He legally demanded, and enthusiastically accepted, 100% sole ownership of the venture capital firm. I took one final step toward the petitioner table, closing the physical distance until I stood looming directly over my husband. "You assumed 100% liability," I whispered, locking my eyes onto his terrified gaze. Marcus let out a choked, agonizing gasp. He slumped forward, his elbows hitting the wooden table with a heavy thud. He buried his face in his trembling hands, hyperventilating as the absolute reality of his destruction crushed his lungs. He had not tricked me into surrendering my life savings. I had meticulously tricked him into claiming sole, legal responsibility for a sinking ship. He had spent months manipulating the judicial system, forging documents, and weaponizing his massive social capital to brutally strip me of my wealth. He thought he was building a massive concrete wall to lock me out of his millions. He completely failed to realize he was wrapping his arms tightly around a $120 million anchor, and I had just gleefully pushed him directly into the freezing ocean. "You owe me $120 million, I stated, my voice echoing off the dark mahogany paneling. Because he was currently defaulting on the primary construction delays, the massive commercial loan had officially breached its stringent financial covenants. Chloe stared at the thick stack of papers resting on the judge's desk, her arrogant mask entirely obliterated. She realized that by using her corporate position to orchestrate his sole ownership, she had legally tied him to the absolute maximum liability possible. She had just effectively bankrupted the man she planned to marry. The forensic trap was flawless. "I am initiating immediate, catastrophic foreclosure," I announced, turning my back on the pathetic, broken man. Judge Thomas Arris picked up his heavy wooden gavel. He looked down at Marcus, his face completely devoid of pity for a man who had actively attempted to weaponize the judicial system against an innocent woman. The seasoned magistrate raised the gavel high into the air. "The total asset forfeiture agreement is finalized," Judge Arris declared, his voice ringing with absolute, inescapable authority. The gavel slammed down against the sounding block with a sharp, deafening crack. The sharp sound finalized my husband's absolute ruin. He was legally, permanently responsible for a debt he could never possibly repay. I walked back toward the respondent table, my heels striking the polished floorboards with an unyielding rhythm. The heavy brass clasps of my leather briefcase waited open, ready to receive the finalized execution order. Behind me, the oppressive, suffocating silence of the mahogany chamber violently shattered. The heavy wooden chair at the petitioner table scraped aggressively against the floorboards, producing a sharp, deafening screech that echoed into the vaulted ceiling. Marcus leaped to his feet. His custom-tailored obsidian suit suddenly looked entirely too large for his rapidly deflating frame. The intoxicating, blinding arrogance that had carried him up the granite steps of the courthouse entirely evaporated, leaving behind a frantic, cornered animal. The blood drained completely from his face, turning his skin a sickly, translucent shade of gray. His chest heaved in rapid, shallow jerks as he struggled to pull stale institutional air into his restricting lungs. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning stark white under the harsh fluorescent lights. "This acquisition is entirely illegal," Marcus shouted, his voice cracking into a high pitch of raw panic. Judge Thomas Arris did not flinch. The seasoned magistrate slowly lowered the notice of absolute assignment of debt. Folding his weathered hands securely over the heavy cardstock, he stared at Marcus with the cold, detached observation of a man watching a highly predictable disaster unfold in slow motion. The uniformed bailiff standing near the heavy oak doors shifted his weight, resting his hand casually on his utility belt, entirely prepared to subdue the spiraling venture capitalist. "You cannot enforce a predatory proxy purchase," Marcus stammered, pointing a shaking finger directly at my back. I turned around, keeping my hands resting lightly against the smooth leather of my briefcase. I did not raise my voice or mirror his frantic, terrified energy. I stood perfectly still, watching the thick blue vein in his neck pulse erratically against his expensive silk collar. He was desperately searching his mind for a corporate legal loophole that simply did not exist. "I possess the liquid capital to fight this," Marcus threatened, a thin layer of cold sweat forming across his forehead. "I will bury you in endless corporate litigation," Marcus added, his breathing growing increasingly ragged and desperate. He was lying directly under oath, desperately attempting to project a ghost of his former financial supremacy. He firmly believed the stolen $15 million resting in his failing Brooklyn Tech hub accounts provided him with enough leverage to delay the inevitable foreclosure. He assumed he could drag me through years of costly civil proceedings, utilizing Thorn Capital resources to slowly bleed my independent wealth dry. He completely failed to understand that his venture capital firm no longer possessed a single dime of untainted liquidity. "Please direct your attention to the second page," I stated, my voice echoing clearly across the vast mahogany chamber. Judge Arris lifted his heavy silver pen, using the metallic tip to carefully separate the dense stack of papers resting on his elevated desk. He turned the perfected Uniform Commercial Code financing statement over, exposing the heavily encrypted financial logs hidden directly beneath it. The court reporter stopped typing for a fraction of a second, her fingers hovering over her stenograph machine as she absorbed the massive shift in the courtroom dynamic. Chloe Vanguard stopped breathing. The senior corporate counsel sat entirely frozen in her tufted leather chair. The massive radiant cut diamond glittering on her left hand suddenly looked like a heavy, inescapable iron shackle. She knew exactly what digital footprints she had carelessly left behind during her midnight wire transfers, and she realized the senior forensic auditor had just successfully tracked every single one of them. Her manicured nails dug painfully into the wooden armrests of her chair. "What exactly am I reviewing, Ms. Croft?" Judge Arris inquired, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses with a slow, deliberate motion. "You are reviewing a federal whistleblower confirmation," I answered, keeping my gaze locked entirely on my husband. Marcus stopped shouting. His mouth hung slightly open as the terrifying reality of the word federal crashed heavily down upon his shoulders. I did not simply bring a standard civil debt collection notice to a routine family court hearing. I had quietly weaponized the absolute, crushing authority of the United States government directly into the state judicial system. "It details severe wire fraud and illegal commingling," I explained, tracking the microscopic, uncontrollable tremor developing in Chloe's hands. Judge Aris leaned heavily forward, his bushy gray eyebrows drawing together in a tight, deeply calculating frown. He scanned the raw, undeniable offshore routing numbers and the complex forensic flowcharts detailing the massive corporate theft. The dense document mathematically demonstrated exactly how Marcus had acquired his supposed pristine liquidity to cover his catastrophic margin calls. The magistrate ran his finger down the cascading columns of extracted metadata, verifying the server origination codes. The petitioner claims he possesses unencumbered capital, I noted, taking a slow, deliberate step towards the center aisle. Marcus swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply against his dry throat. He looked like a man standing on a trapdoor, waiting for the heavy lever to be pulled. The sweat on his forehead beaded and rolled down his cheek, absorbing into his silk collar. Those funds were actively stolen from protected client escrow accounts, I stated, the cold truth slicing through the heavy, suffocating courtroom air. Chloe let out a strangled, pathetic gasp. She slumped forward, resting her elbows heavily against the petitioner table, desperately hiding her pale face behind her manicured fingers. The federal escrow transaction logs printed clearly on the second page proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that she had utilized her elite corporate position to completely bypass the firm firewalls. The extracted metadata explicitly highlighted her unique digital signature, authorizing the illicit transfer of $450,000 directly to a Manhattan diamond importer. She had maliciously embezzled vulnerable investor capital to artificially inflate her lover's balance sheet and purchase her own extravagant engagement ring. Judge Aris looked up from the printed papers, his expression rapidly hardening into a mask of pure, unadulterated judicial fury. Family court judges routinely dealt with petty hidden assets and offshore tax evasion, but blatantly presenting embezzled client funds as legitimate corporate liquidity inside a sworn courtroom constituted catastrophic, undeniable perjury. He looked directly at Chloe, instantly recognizing the severe attorney misconduct glaring brightly from the printed pages. She had not just ruined her lucrative corporate career, she had effectively drafted her own permanent disbarment papers and signed a direct, irrefutable confession to a federal crime. "I am issuing a formal notice of immediate default," I announced, my voice carrying the absolute finality of a seasoned executioner dropping a heavy blade. Because the primary construction loan for his failing commercial tech hub was directly tied to incredibly strict financial covenants. Any federal investigation into the holding company triggered an automatic, inescapable default on the entire portfolio. I legally owned the $120 million note. I possessed the absolute, unchecked right to demand the entire balloon payment right here, right now. Standing on the polished floor of this sworn courtroom, the legal architecture was entirely flawless. "You cannot do this to me," Marcus whispered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "I already did," I replied, staring directly at his pale, profusely sweating face. Marcus frantically reached into the breast pocket of his custom-tailored obsidian suit. He pulled out his encrypted mobile phone, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped the heavy metallic device onto the hard floorboards. He desperately tried to access his primary corporate banking dashboard, praying to any available deity that his stolen liquidity remained untouched. He needed to see the glowing green numbers to reassure his fractured, spiraling mind that he still held some minor fraction of operational power. He swiped the smooth glass screen, entering his biometric passcodes with incredibly clumsy, uncoordinated fingers. The secure banking application loaded, but it did not display the millions of dollars he so desperately expected to see. A harsh, glaring red error banner flashed across the entirety of the digital display. The severe alert illuminated his terrified, hollow face in a sickening crimson glow. The automated system explicitly stated that the assets were completely inaccessible due to an ongoing federal regulatory hold. "The Securities and Exchange Commission received my packet at dawn," I explained, watching the very last shreds of his sanity completely evaporate into the cold air. "They initiated an absolute structural freeze on every account," I added, offering him a cold, entirely empty stare. Marcus stared blindly at his phone, his mind actively short-circuiting as the impossible. Devastating math finally connected in his brain. His massive illusion of immense wealth shattered violently into a million jagged pieces. The elite venture capital firm he had just sworn under oath to own entirely was currently locked down by federal regulators. The $15 million he had stolen from my marital accounts was permanently frozen inside a decaying Delaware shell company. The toxic commercial debt he had just voluntarily assumed full personal liability for was currently defaulting directly into my hands. He was entirely broke. He was massively in debt. He was facing imminent, inescapable federal indictments. He dropped the phone. The heavy device hit the polished wooden floorboards with a sharp, echoing crack, the glass screen splintering outward from the immediate point of impact. He fell backward into his wooden chair, his entire body fully deflating as the crushing, physical weight of $120 million settled permanently onto his shoulders. The pristine illusion of his corporate empire was completely dead, and he was the one who had eagerly signed the death certificate. The heavy silence in courtroom 3 possessed a physical, suffocating density. Marcus hit the seat of his tufted leather chair with the dead weight of a collapsed structure. His broad shoulders sagged inward, completely dissolving the pristine lines of his custom obsidian suit. The intoxicating, blinding arrogance that had carried him up the granite steps of the Foley Square courthouse was entirely eradicated. In its place remained only the hollow, terrified shell of a man who had just voluntarily shackled himself to a $120 million anchor. I did not offer him a single glance of sympathy. I stood perfectly still in the center of the mahogany well, letting the devastating reality of the federal attachments settle over the room. The Securities and Exchange Commission whistleblower confirmation glowed brightly in the mind of the presiding magistrate. The heavily encrypted financial logs resting on the elevated bench were not mere allegations. They were absolute, mathematically unassailable execution orders. A sharp, sudden clatter shattered the heavy quiet. Chloe Vanguard dropped her thick yellow legal pad. The heavy cardboard backing struck the polished floorboards, sliding a few inches before coming to a halt near the leg of the petitioner table. She did not reach down to retrieve it. Her manicured hands hovered in the cold, conditioned air, trembling with a violent, uncontrollable kinetic energy. She stared blindly at the scattered pages of her meticulously drafted legal extortion, her jaw hanging slightly open. As the senior corporate counsel for Thorn Capital, Chloe possessed a razor-sharp understanding of federal compliance regulations. She knew exactly what the extracted server metadata logs signified. She recognized the catastrophic gravity of the escrow transaction records I had just submitted to the court. The stolen client funds she had illegally commingled to inflate Marcus's liquidity pool and purchase her massive radiant-cut diamond engagement ring were now a matter of permanent judicial record. Her breathing escalated into rapid, shallow gasps. Her chest heaved against the fabric of her luxurious white cashmere coat. She was actively hyperventilating, struggling to pull the stale institutional oxygen into her restricting lungs. The smug, predatory smirk she had worn in the marble corridor just 20 minutes prior was completely obliterated. Her flawless, manicured facade shattered into a million jagged pieces. She realized with sickening clarity that she was no longer merely a participant in a hostile divorce proceeding. She was the primary target of an imminent, massive federal fraud investigation. "I am going to federal prison," Chloe whispered, her voice cracking into a high-pitched wheeze of pure terror. She looked down at her left hand. The flawless diamond ring she had purchased with embezzled investor capital suddenly looked like a heavy, inescapable iron shackle. She grabbed her own wrist, her fingernails digging painfully into her pale skin, desperately trying to ground herself in a reality that was rapidly spinning out of control. The brilliant legal career she had spent over a decade meticulously building was disintegrating right in front of her terrified eyes. Every extortion threat she had maliciously drafted on company time was now a signed confession resting on the judge's desk. Marcus finally forced his head upward, his bloodshot eyes darting frantically around the dark mahogany chamber. The realization of his total financial annihilation stripped away his remaining sanity. He was trapped. The massive commercial real estate project in Brooklyn was currently defaulting without any institutional backers to save it. The venture capital firm he had just sworn under oath to own entirely was actively locked down by federal regulators. The $15 million he had stolen from my marital accounts was permanently frozen inside a decaying Delaware shell company. He was facing over $120 million in immediate, unencumbered personal liability, and he did not possess a single dime of clean liquidity to fight it. He pushed himself out of his leather chair. His legs wobbled, his knees knocking awkwardly against the heavy wooden edge of the petitioner table. He ignored his hyperventilating mistress entirely, abandoning her to her fate without a second thought. He stumbled toward the center aisle, closing the physical distance between us with the frantic, clumsy desperation of a drowning man. He was sweating profusely, the moisture soaking into the expensive silk collar of his shirt. "Gianna, please listen to me," Marcus begged. Reaching a trembling hand out toward my slate-gray suit, I took a single, deliberate step backward. I maintained a perimeter of absolute, untouchable professional distance. I did not flinch, and I did not break eye contact. "We can stop this foreclosure right now," Marcus pleaded, thick beads of cold sweat rolling down his pale temples. I kept my expression completely dead and clinical, observing the frantic pulse pounding against his neck. "I will tear up the divorce settlement," Marcus offered, his voice cracking with pathetic, desperate hope. He frantically pointed back toward the elevated bench, gesturing wildly at the 30-page total asset forfeiture agreement resting safely under the judge's hands. He actually believed he could simply reverse the sworn testimony he had gleefully provided just minutes ago. He thought he could casually undo the legal severance he had violently forced upon me through malicious coercion. He believed his vast social capital could still save him from the mathematical certainty of his ruin. "I will give you everything back," Marcus promised, tears of pure panic pooling in the corners of his eyes. "You have absolutely nothing left to give," I answered smoothly. My voice echoed off the dark mahogany paneling, devoid of a single ounce of warmth or mercy. Marcus choked on a ragged breath. His outstretched hand dropped heavily to his side. He stared at me, his mind actively short-circuiting as the inescapable permanence of his ruin finally crushed his spirit. He had built a massive, fraudulent empire on a foundation of stolen capital, and he had expected me to quietly absorb the fallout. He had entirely miscalculated the sheer, uncompromising lethality of a senior forensic auditor. I looked down at his terrified, sweating face with glacial detachment. I did not raise my voice to match his frantic hysteria. I did not scream about the public humiliation at the charity gala or the freezing rain outside the cheap motel room in Queens. I simply delivered the final, calculated strike. "You forgot to read the fine print," I stated quietly. I turned my back on him. The swift, deliberate motion severed our interaction with absolute, unyielding finality. I walked smoothly back to the respondent table, my heels striking the polished floorboards with an unbroken, synchronized rhythm. I did not look at him again. I shifted my entire focus to the heavy leather briefcase resting on the scratched wooden surface. I reached into the side pocket and withdrew my specialized crafting scalpel, sliding it securely into its designated leather loop. I packed away my portable document scanner, ensuring the cables were neatly coiled. I moved with perfect, steady precision, treating the packed courtroom exactly like a sterile corporate boardroom following a successful hostile takeover. I closed the heavy top flap of the briefcase. I engaged the heavy brass clasps. The sharp, metallic clicks echoed loudly through the silent chamber, serving as the definitive punctuation mark on a decade-long marriage. Up on the elevated bench, Judge Thomas Arris adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. He had watched the entire exchange with the cold, detached observation of a seasoned magistrate who just witnessed a flawless legal execution. He possessed zero tolerance for individuals who weaponize the judicial system to commit federal extortion. He slowly ran his index finger over the fabricated balance sheets, tracing the extracted metadata logs, and thoroughly reviewing the undeniable escrow embezzlement proof resting under his weathered hands. He cataloged every single felony they had committed in their blind pursuit of my destruction. The judge picked up his heavy wooden gavel, his expression hardening into a mask of pure judicial fury. "This court finds the petitioner bound by his sworn testimony," Judge Aris declared, his voice ringing with absolute, inescapable authority. Marcus let out a low, agonizing groan. He covered his face with his trembling hands as his sole ownership of the toxic debt was permanently locked into the court record. There would be no appellate rescue. "The total asset forfeiture agreement stands as executed," Judge Aris continued, staring directly at my husband. The magistrate then shifted his severe, uncompromising gaze toward the petitioner table. Chloe was still clutching her chest, rocking slightly back and forth in her leather chair, completely paralyzed by the impending destruction of her life. "Ms. Vanguard, your conduct is a catastrophic violation of federal law," Judge Aris stated, his tone dropping into a harsh, punitive register. Chloe squeezed her eyes shut, a pathetic whimper escaping her trembling lips. "I am officially referring you to the New York State Bar Disciplinary Committee," Judge Aris announced loudly. He picked up his heavy silver pen, making a sharp, definitive notation on the primary docket file. He was initiating the formal administrative process that would swiftly and permanently strip her of her legal licenses. She would never practice corporate law in the state of New York again. "Furthermore, given the severe evidence of federal wire fraud presented today," Judge Aris stated, sweeping his gaze across the entire courtroom, "I am ordering an immediate, comprehensive freeze on all assets tied to Thorn Capital." Marcus collapsed onto his knees, the expensive fabric of his custom obsidian suit wrinkled against the cold, polished floorboards. He was completely broken, staring blankly at the wood grain as the final pillars of his fabricated reality crashed down around him. "All personal and corporate holdings belonging to Marcus Thorn are hereby seized," Judge Aris commanded without hesitation. The magistrate did not offer them a single sliver of judicial mercy. He was actively locking down the crime scene, ensuring that neither Marcus nor Chloe could move a single stolen dollar before the federal authorities arrived to take them into custody. The massive commercial debt was now entirely mine to enforce, while the criminal liabilities were entirely theirs to suffer. "These assets will remain frozen pending a full federal fraud investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission," Judge Aris concluded. He raised the heavy wooden gavel high into the conditioned air of the courtroom. The polished wood caught the harsh fluorescent light overhead. He brought it down against the sounding block with a sharp, deafening crack. The explosive sound shattered the remaining tension in the mahogany chamber. The legal proceeding was officially terminated. The venture capital firm was dead. The extortion plot was dismantled. I gripped the heavy leather handle of my briefcase, feeling the solid, grounding weight of my absolute victory. I stood perfectly still, entirely prepared to walk out of the Foley Square courthouse as the sole architect of my own flawless redemption. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung open, groaning under the weight of the absolute finality they had just witnessed. I did not look back at the petitioner table, but the sounds of their total collapse followed me into the marble corridor. Marcus was weeping, a loud, ragged, and entirely pathetic wailing that echoed off the high, vaulted ceilings. The sharp, unyielding hands of the court bailiffs grabbed his custom-tailored shoulders, hauling him out of his chair. He was no longer a towering venture capitalist. He was a financially obliterated shell, dragging his expensive leather shoes across the polished stone as he was escorted directly into the custody of the waiting federal agents. Chloe staggered out moments later, flanked by a second pair of officers. Her pristine white cashmere coat was slipping off her trembling shoulders. She was completely shell-shocked, her eyes glassy and vacant. The federal agents had already confiscated her briefcase, locking away the digital devices she had so arrogantly used to commit extortion on company time. The massive radiant-cut diamond that had glittered so violently on her left hand was conspicuously absent, immediately seized as stolen criminal evidence. They were being marched toward the freight elevators, destined for the sterile, windowless intake rooms of a federal detention center. As I walked out the front doors of the courthouse and stepped into the biting morning air, my secondary encrypted mobile device vibrated quietly in my pocket. I pulled it out and reviewed a single automated notification from my offshore digital vault. The final piece of the execution had just seamlessly locked into place. Marcus and Chloe believed they were the only ones facing federal indictments, but they had entirely forgotten the architectural roots of their fraud. When I handed the Delaware Shell Company ledgers over to the judge, I did not just expose Marcus. The ledgers definitively proved that his mother, Sylvia Thorne, had weaponized her fictitious catering vendor to actively wash my stolen marital assets. The federal authorities were currently arriving at her multi-million-dollar Upper East Side penthouse, completely prepared to seize the property and place her in handcuffs for international money laundering. I pocketed the phone, the cold wind whipping my hair. I had not just destroyed my husband and his mistress, I had systematically eradicated his entire toxic bloodline from the financial sector forever. 6 months later, the freezing winter rain had long surrendered to the bright, relentless heat of a late summer morning. I stood at the absolute epicenter of a massive, bustling construction site in the heart of Brooklyn. The deafening roar of heavy machinery and the rhythmic pounding of industrial pile drivers vibrated deeply into the soles of my heavy leather boots. I wore a tailored charcoal suit paired with a bright yellow hard hat, my eyes scanning the towering steel skeleton rising steadily into the clear blue sky. This was the $120 million commercial tech hub that had served as the toxic anchor to Thorne Capital. It no longer belonged to Marcus, and it was no longer a failing, catastrophic sinkhole. The moment the federal regulators froze his firm, I aggressively executed my rights as his primary commercial creditor. I foreclosed on the entire portfolio, stripping the venture capital holding company down to its copper wiring. The legal proceedings were swift and merciless. Every single asset Marcus possessed was brutally liquidated to cover the massive debt deficit he had so arrogantly sworn under oath to own. His current reality was a stark, unforgiving contrast to the luxury he had once weaponized against me. Marcus was currently sitting in a maximum security federal penitentiary, awaiting trial for perjury, severe wire fraud, and the gross embezzlement of protected client escrow funds, without a dime to his name. He was entirely dependent on an overworked public defender who had already strongly advised him to accept a 20-year plea deal. Chloe had suffered a similarly spectacular annihilation. The New York State Bar had stripped her legal licenses within a week. She was permanently disbarred, bankrupt, and currently residing in a federal holding camp for women, facing a decade behind bars for executing extortion through a corporate server. Sylvia Thorne was fighting her own hopeless legal battle, her precious social standing entirely obliterated as her penthouse was auctioned off by the federal government. I stepped closer to the edge of the massive foundational pit. Nathaniel Croft stood beside me, his hands resting comfortably in the pockets of his dark trousers. The billionaire private equity titan watched the convoy of cement trucks pouring fresh, pristine concrete into the massive subterranean trenches. "You found the bottom," Nathaniel noted, his deep voice cutting cleanly through the noise of the active site. "I had to dig out all the rot before we could build," I answered, keeping my gaze locked on the flowing gray concrete. I had fired the negligent structural engineers Marcus had hired and brought in a top-tier architectural firm. We excavated the sinking, compromised soil, reinforced the subterranean water table with solid steel pylons, and poured a flawless, impenetrable base. The development was no longer bleeding capital. It was fully funded, structurally sound, and projected to generate hundreds of millions in legitimate, sustainable revenue by the next fiscal quarter. The empire was finally mine, built strictly on my own unyielding terms. Nathaniel offered a rare, genuine smile of profound respect, giving a single nod before turning to walk back to his waiting vehicle. I remained at the edge of the pit, breathing in the scent of wet earth and drying concrete. I had stepped into this marriage hoping to build a quiet, steady partnership, only to be met with theft, psychological abuse, and blinding elitist arrogance. But I did not shrink when they tried to crush me. I audited their cruelty, traced their weaknesses, and orchestrated a masterclass in total financial annihilation. True leverage does not require you to scream your worth into a void. It requires absolute silence, unyielding patience, and terrifying precision. Toxic people will always mistake your quiet observation for weakness, assuming they can exploit your boundaries without consequence. But when you finally stop fighting for their validation and redirect that brilliant energy into your own independence, you become entirely untouchable. Never let a parasite convince you that you are the one who is small when they try to back you into a corner. Do not panic. Simply calculate the exact weight of the walls and then bring the entire building down directly on their heads. Thank you so much for following this incredible journey of forensic revenge and absolute empowerment. Navigating the treacherous waters of a toxic marriage and financial betrayal can make you feel entirely isolated, but you are never truly alone. Have you ever had to draw a hard, permanent line in the sand and walk away from someone who tried to exploit your boundaries? How did you execute your own flawless escape? I would absolutely love to hear your powerful stories of survival and success in the comments section down below. Your experiences are invaluable, and your strength might be exactly what another listener needs to hear today. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more content about overcoming betrayal and building an unshakable, independent life, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Stay brilliant, trust your own calculations, and always remember to protect your foundation.